I won't tell you who I am. I can't tell you where this happened, and I can't tell you when this happened. I got death threats for months after this. I had to quit. I had to move. I had to change my entire identity to stop people from finding me. Some of you sickos will no doubt put in time and research into working out all the details yourself. But just let me make it clear that my details were expunged from the employment records, and you'll never, ever find me. And so, I can make my confession in peace. I used to work as a park ranger at a well-known, frequently visited national park. At this particular national park, there was an old ghost story that the veteran rangers used to tell about one of our number who heard a noise coming from a lake one day. The noise had apparently sounded like a puppy yelping and splashing, but the ranger who heard it couldn't swim and wasn't about to put himself in danger of drowning just to save a dog. The next day, the body of a young child washed up on the shore. It was never a dog out there. It was a child that had fallen into the lake after being out there exploring unsupervised. The ranger was devastated, his spirit crushed that his selfishness had resulted in the death of an innocent child. He was haunted by the thought, took to drinking, wore himself down, until one night, while sleeping in his cabin, he heard a familiar noise coming from the lake. It was the sound of a little boy, crying out to be rescued. He ran to the lakeside, dived into the water, and struggled his way into the center of the body of water until he reached the site of the splashing. But there, he only saw the smiling, bloated corpse of that same little boy who dragged him beneath the lake and drowned him, just as he had. That's the way the story went, and to be honest, I thought it was the biggest load of bullcrap I'd ever heard in my life. I told the crusty old-timers that same thing, that I'd have to be of diminished capacity to believe a crock of crap like that. But instead of laughing or whatever, like, okay, maybe this guy isn't as dumb as we first thought, they all got pissy about it. They told me not to disrespect the angry spirits of the departed. But then, it was my turn to laugh. I could tell the difference between them getting annoyed over me disrespecting the dead or whatever, and them getting annoyed over me just disrespecting their dumb stories. The following week, I found I had my shift pattern switched to nights. I confronted them about it, told them I was not impressed that they were that immature to switch my shifts up, but they insisted that it was only to cover for a guy whose mom had taken ill and had been forced to drive back to his home state in order to care for her. I didn't believe a word of it, and I was just straight up angry at that point. Angry that a pair of grown men would lie about something like, basically just to gaslight me. But I didn't want to show them how frustrated I was. I just take their crap on the chin, so to speak, and not give them the satisfaction. So, the first night I'm there in the lakeside cabin, I'm settling in to prepare for a long night of utter boredom, brewing coffee, and playing dumb games on the phone, when I hear something from outside the cabin. I put down my phone, get up, and walk over to the door to open it so I could listen out for what it is. But I recognize it instantly. It's the sound of splashing, coupled with the sound of a child crying out for help between spluttered breaths. Haha, dickheads, very funny. I remember shouting out into the darkness. Think you could scare me with your dumb stories? Well, I didn't believe in them, and I don't believe you now. Try it with someone with an IQ as low as yours. This was obviously their little game playing out, their attempt to scare me into submission and believing their backward ghost story. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I went back inside, slamming the door shut and jamming my AirPods in on full volume to block out the noise. They were selfish, vindictive. That's what I had told myself anyway. But apparently not determined enough to keep playing that sound from whatever speaker system they'd set up around the cabin. Because when I paused my music, like 20 minutes later, the noise was gone, and all was quiet again. The next morning, just after sunrise, I pack up my stuff and prepare to leave the cabin. I was so exhausted and irritated by the prank they pulled. I wasn't prepared to wait for them to arrive. I figured if I did, I'd be so angry at seeing them, I might have knocked some of their teeth out. That, of course, would get me fired, and I simply could not afford that. Not with the economy in the state that it was. But as I'm walking to my truck, something catches my eye from the lakeside. Something small and sodden that the gentle waves of the lake lapped against. I turned to look and saw what it was, and when I did, I dropped my bag in pure horror and disbelief at what I was staring at. It was the body of a child, face down in the dirt. I pulled up my phone, dialed 911, and basically screamed at the operator for an ambulance to get out to the place I was based at. They had to send a helicopter in the end, but before it showed up, the two crusty old rangers rolled up in their truck, and their eyeballs almost fell out of their head when they saw me trying to perform CPR on the dead kid. I tried, and tried, and I tried, but he was gone, long gone, and it was all my fault. I ended up word vomiting about what happened the night before, telling them everything, how I thought the whole thing was a part of a prank, part of the punishment for not believing their story. They claimed to have no idea what I was talking about, which angered me even more. But when they asked me why I didn't help the kid, I flipped. I rushed one of the older guys, tackled him, and beat the living hell out of him before I was dragged off and talked back down to earth. But I couldn't ever really calm down, not until the chopper arrived and put that kid's body on a stretcher. The paramedics seemed furious that there was no one to save. I remember one of them explicitly shouting over the din of the rotor blades that the kid's been dead for hours when they took off, and I drove back to go on indefinite paid leave. I thought that might have been the end of it, and that I'd have the time and space to get over what happened. But I didn't have time. Someone leaked information on what had happened. I don't know if it was that old-timer I decked, the other ranger, or the paramedics. But somehow, someone got a hold of my contact details, and the threatening calls began. I'll never forget the night my girlfriend answered the phone in our apartment, saying hello in that happy, chirpy way she always used to. I watched as her face went from all smiley to neutral to downright horrified. It was the first of many death threats, the first of many, many calls, handwritten letters and emails that told me I was an awful person, that I didn't deserve to live, that I was dead to the world the night I let that poor, innocent young boy drown in the lake, when his lungs filled with water and the death spasms racked body. He wasn't the only one to die. I died too. Needless to say, she wasn't my girlfriend for much longer, and I don't even blame her. There aren't many people who could handle that kind of abuse, and I only got through it myself by the skin of my teeth. And so, that led me to where I am today. I live alone, in a state far, far away from that national park where I allowed a child to drown. I legally changed my name, changed my entire look, so no one from my old life would be able to recognize me. I went through an intense period of transformation. The old me is a ghost, as good as dead, dust in the wind, and no one will ever find me. No one. I've worked in the U.S. Forest Service here in Texas for just shy of 10 years now. I love my job, and it's rare for anything particularly creepy or scary to occur. But, having worked for this job for so long, I do have my fair share of stories I can share that might just make the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. For example, we sometimes get jaguars hunting in the forest here, a particularly scary big cat, and that's because of what they do with their prey once they're caught and subdued. So, just picture the scene. You're walking through the trees on some bright sunny day, when all of a sudden, you start to smell something rotten. You look around, but there's nothing to be seen. Just the picturesque view of the pines and the sound of birdsong floating through the green. Then, something hits the top of your head. Something wet. You place a hand on the top of your head, feeling something cold and slimy dribbling through your hair. You bring your hand down to see what it is, hoping it's not bird crap, only it's something way worse. It's blood. You look up, and hanging up in a tree, just a few feet above your head, is the mutilated, half-eaten corpse of an animal. Guts torn out, skin shredded, face half-eaten with hooves or paws missing, with broken pieces of bone protruding from cracked limbs. It seems utterly bizarre, but the jaguar has good reason for doing all this heavy lifting. If the jaguar does not bother to hoist its kill into the tree, it risks losing its meal to other more ground-based predators or scavengers. Creepy, yeah, but that kind of natural world stuff is nothing compared to some of the other stuff I've encountered during my time in the Forest Service. So, this other time, I'm on a routine walkthrough on some of the trails to make sure all the directional signs and information markers for tourists are all in order. There's a large rock protrusion about 100 meters off this trail, like this big sandstone boulder that juts out of the earth that is kind of like a shallow cave carved out on one side that had been worn away from thousands of years of wind erosion. As I get close, I see a guy in what I first thought was camouflage hunting gear, hanging around the entrance. I call out to him, just some friendly greeting, nothing threatening, and he turns to look at me. Only he doesn't say a word. He just runs off through the trees. I start getting worried about what he was doing in the cave, terrified he's left a body or something there. And honestly, I thank God he hadn't. But it seems like he did leave something behind. I mean, I'm not 100% sure it was him that did this, and I've often considered the possibility that it was him that happened to cross this little find first, and seeing me, got the idea in his head that it was me that left the thing there. He got that idea into his head, saw me, and freaked. But when I walked into that little cave and shined my flashlight around, I saw something that would completely explain why he was so quick to run away, whatever his motivations were doing so. Teeth. There was a little circular path of dirt, one that looked like it had been raked over to clear some space, and in the middle of it all were a bunch of human teeth. I don't know why they were there. I don't know who left them or why, but I did what I could. I gathered them into a little plastic bag I had on me that I had previously contained my lunch and took them down to the nearest police station, giving a little description of the guy that I had seen run away from the cave. I have the usual wild animal encounters, weird noises during the night, but I've never forgotten those teeth. I have no explanation to offer up at all, but it certainly does make for a good little campfire story. So, I live in San Juan County on the Utah side. I was with some friends and we wanted to party, and my friend said her boyfriend had alcohol, so we went to his house. We ended up in this place on the res, in the middle of nowhere, by a shack, and found him and his dog asleep in a ditch. The first thing I notice is that there are bones everywhere. Next, the dog got up, but it got up really creepily. I've never been afraid of any dog ever, but the way this one got up gave me the chills. It was super skinny looking and looked like it had mange because its fur was patchy and its skin looked leathery. Its eyes looked human, and it kept balancing on the back of its legs while crouched over. The whites of his eyes were also red, while the irises were a light brown. Next, the guy got up. He was really sketchy. At first, we just thought he was a drunk, but he was acting incredibly strange. As soon as he got in the car, it reeked like actual death. Like he smelled rotten and foul. We had to roll the windows down. He was wearing baggy clothing and 4 different jackets. We'll call him B. He was talking incoherently and kept yawning while he talked, but he seemed to walk mostly normal, except he had a weird limp that made him sway with every step. Turned out he didn't have any drinks, but we had already gotten him, so we went to go get another friend that we knew. So, We pick up this friend. We'll call him A. A has alcohol, but we have nowhere to party. So B says he knows a spot. We proceed to let B guide us back to the res and to a really sketchy trailer a few miles away where we initially picked him up at. The dog is there, waiting for us. At this point, I just wanted to go home because the whole scenario was giving me awful vibes, and everything in my body was telling me I needed to leave. I'm not a superstitious person at all either, but B's girlfriend was my ride home, so I had no other choice. I decided at that moment that I wasn't going to drink or do drugs with them because of the circumstances. We get out of the car, and the creepy dog comes straight towards me and knocks me down and starts trying to hunt me. B got the dog off me immediately though, and I ran into the abandoned trailer camper. Some of the windows were broken and everything was old and dusty. The carpet was torn up and there was no furniture except for some lawn chairs. I took a seat, and I hear B whisper to A that he has some spice. My 3 other friends get into the trailer with me and start taking shots of alcohol that A brought. B whips out a bowl to smoke something. My friend asks what it is, and he says it's weed. They start smoking, and it doesn't smell like weed at all. I look at it under the flashlight and realize it is indeed spice, and try telling them that it's not weed and that we should probably leave. They make fun of me and take more shots and more hits. I look out the window and see the creepy dog crawling and running around the trailer. A, at this point, is pretty drunk and starts yelling at B for killing his dad a few days prior. B gets flustered and leaves with his girlfriend. A few minutes later, the dog tries to open the door with its paws. It doesn't succeed, but I could see it trying since the door had a window. I got really scared because this dog was not normal and was just staring at me through the glass. I start sharing my location with a few people in case something wrong happens. A is crying about how B murdered his dad on the res and that he can't bring himself to forgive B for what he's done. They are apparently close cousins. I just wanted to go home. B returns with his girlfriend and a fight breaks out, so we all leave B and his dog at the trailer. Then, B's girlfriend randomly has a psychotic episode as we get back to town and decides she wants everybody else in the car to walk home. She screams at them to get out, and they all walk for over a mile to get to their homes. She drops me off for some reason, without saying a word. When I get home, I check my phone to find that my friends were scared because something kept throwing rocks at them on their way back. Anyway, I'm literally convinced this was an experience with a skinwalker, or something. Everything there was Navajo except me, if that makes a difference. I know it's cheesy in writing, but it was actually really scary, and I was crying on the way back home. I don't know how to describe the dog and the way it walked, but it wasn't normal. Anyway, I might just be paranoid, but everything about the situation was honestly just so scary and weird that I felt like I needed to share it with somebody and see what their thoughts were. I've been terrified and haven't been able to sleep because if it wasn't a skinwalker, it was a murderer who probably hadn't showered since the murder, that had a creepy dog that tried to drug us. What do you think? So, I had this experience that happened when I was about 8 or 9 with my parents. Every time I think of the story, talk about it, try to tell someone, I literally get goosebumps and my eyes water. Even typing this, I have goosebumps and my eyes are watering. I have accidentally found this and I have the same goosebumps again. I do believe what I saw as a child was a skinwalker, and now I'm incredibly frightened. Before I dive into my encounter, does anyone know any more information that's actually legit? As far as the story goes, I live on the East Coast of the United States. I was at a park with my mother and father when I was just a kid. I was playing on the playground, but the sun was going down, and my parents told me that we had to leave. So, we started to walk back to the parking lot. As we walk through this very heavily wooded park, me and my mother see something. We were in a more open, circular, green, grassy area, surrounded by total forest. We were on one side and this thing came out from the woods on the other side. Pause. This is where I have to stop and take a breath, because as I write this, my eyes are watering and I'm getting goosebumps. This is so hard to talk about. Back to the story. "John, look at that over in the woods," my mother says to my father. I grabbed my mother's hand and asked her what it was. She just said in this really shaky voice, "I don't know, but it's not normal." My dad proceeded to tell us that it is just a deer and to keep moving before we scare it. But then this creature looked at us. It wasn't super close, so all I could see was this white thing on all fours, with a head shaped like the dumb stereotypical aliens we see on TV. It was not something I had ever seen. After it noticed us 100%, it walked forward. Then it stood up on two legs and walked closer. Not like an animal anymore, but like a human. I still couldn't make out a face, and to this day can't. But it wasn't a deer. When it switched to two legs, it still looked like this white, oddly shaped thing. Again, kind of like a typical alien we see on TV. My mother and I stood in total shock, fear, and awe. We didn't move our bodies. The only thing that moved was our hands clasped, which grew tighter and tighter. My father, on the other hand, is a total disbeliever in anything supernatural or religious. So, him being totally fine was just standing watching what we thought was a deer. After this thing scared the living hell out of us and made our spines tingle, it turned around and ran back into the woods. First on two legs, then on all four. My mother and I didn't speak about it until we got in the safety of our home back in the city, a good hour from this foresty park. But to this day, only me and my mother really remember what we saw and how bone-chilling it was. And as I said, I literally cannot talk about it or even write this without having to wipe my eyes, which just keep watering, and my nose, which keeps running. I can wipe away my tears and my snot, but the goosebumps remain. If you stuck and read through all of that, I appreciate it. It's something that still gives me the creeps today. Honestly, it's single-handedly the most terrifying otherworld type of experience I've ever had, which I only have one other. Here's some bonus information about me. I live on the East Coast. I'm a quarter Native American. My mother's father was full-blooded, and her mother was half. But her father was taken to one of those re-education schools back in the day. They would take Native American children, erase their culture, and make them essentially good white children. I have no clue if any of this is relevant. I just read that skinwalkers are a Native American thing. My dad is not Native at all. When I was a kid, I told other paranormal buffs on my school about this experience, and they said it sounded like the Jersey Devil, which apparently has been seen on the East Coast. Hi. I saw a Dogman, a black wolf face, standing up on 2 feet, hunched over, about 6 feet tall, standing straight up. The Dogman would have been about 7 feet tall. I am 5'9", so I could tell after I went back about where its head was compared to mine on the trees. I am a registered nurse, so I am used to weighing people and asking their height, etc. It was tall and skinny, with a hump or mane on its neck. It was standing slightly turned to its left, my right. The hair was short, smooth, well-groomed, like a beagle or a Labrador dog. Its eyes were white, like they glowed or self-illuminated. At 3 p.m. on a hot sunny afternoon, 90 degrees, August 20th, 2019. I was in Freedom, north of Pittsburgh, about 30 minutes. I am a Bigfooter, ghost hunter, UFO alien pursuer, paranormal investigator. Took classes with cryptid director of the U.S.A. at Eastern Gateway Community College in Ohio. The Dogman held its paws up to its chest, limp-wristed style, with the elbows sticking out. It looked uncomfortable holding its elbows out. It did not move. It just stood there. I was in a rural area outside of town. Reports of Bigfoot activity in the area. I am slightly telepathic, psychic, whatever you want to call it. I had a feeling that Bigfoot had been in the area recently on the property. So I said a prayer. I come in peace and light and love of God. I mean, no harm or disrespect. Please show me a sign of your presence or show yourself. Please do not hurt or scare me. Later, when I am leaving in my car, driving down the gravel road to a paved road, there was the Dogman standing by the side of the road, about 3 car lengths from the road in the bushes and trees. I could not see it from the waist down due to the bushes. Normal dog paws, like a pet dog. They were not typical Dogman hands, like a raccoon or a human with hair. Mouth closed the whole time, which was weird. It was not panting due to the heat of 90 degrees. It was next to a small stream. Was it drinking water? Did it hear my prayer to Bigfoot and show up? It was in the shade of a grove of trees, so the white eyes were not sun glare. It was really weird. I felt like it was waiting for me. I backed my car up a few feet to look at it from a slightly different angle. Went forward a bit, backward, forward. The last time I went backwards, it seemed like it stood up a tiny bit straighter. The first time it moved. Scared the crap out of me. I floored my car and drove out of there. I forgot to take a picture. I was so mad at myself. When I got home and realized I forgot to take a photo. Now I understand why a witness to a strange encounter forgets to take a picture. I was in shock, disbelief, perplexed, happy, scared, mixed up emotions. I thought that it was a Bigfoot at first when I was driving down the gravel road and I saw the big black creature standing there. I thought it was a Bigfoot until I saw the ears. Then I pulled my car up in front of it and I was like, what? That's a Dogman. That's not a Bigfoot. I actually was kind of disappointed it wasn't a Bigfoot. I was told by a psychic it was a skinwalker, Native American warrior. They want to be remembered and not forgotten. She said leave a Native American offering of tobacco, whiskey, and apples. She also said to pour salt around my house so it doesn't look in my windows at night. Pray to God, Jesus, to protect me. She said I will see it again. Another psychic I know said that they are interdimensional, and she has seen a Dogman twice not too far away from where I saw that Dogman, but on the other side of the Ohio River, in Hopewell, Center Township, Pennsylvania. The Dogman I saw was in Freedom, Pennsylvania, which, if I drove from that location, I saw the Dogman to the road the psychic saw it on twice. It would take about 20 minutes. This happened just last month. I'm a broker for a local real estate firm around the area. I'm gonna keep my identity concealed in case I risk anyone I know or work for hearing this. You know how things just happen to leak out. The area I operate in is a very small old farm town. With that brings a lot of the retirement community and people looking to escape insane housing prices from larger cities all around. So they come here. The terrain is high desert, lots of shrubbery, but still lots of pine. We got rattlesnakes, tons of deer, skunks, the whole gamut. Lots of cattle, lots of agriculture, lots of farming, you name it. The plus side is there are many properties out there for those looking to escape, for the folks who wish to remain out of town, secluded in complete privacy. That's what my story is about. I had gotten a call from a lady and her husband about wanting to view an older manufactured home that was an owner-carry contract, and they were interested in viewing the property. The property itself sits out near a bunch of timberland, owned by the timber company, and sits on a hilly 5 acres. The property has been on the market for some time now, I want to say a year, so you can imagine the owner was more than thrilled to have somebody interested in seeing it, even if they didn't exactly have the 20% down they would need. the owner would be willing to work with them. All the more reason for them to come out and see it. After speaking with the lady on the phone, we agreed upon meeting at the property the following morning. The following morning came, a beautiful sunny day in June, and I made my way there. It's off a major interstate, about 10 minutes down a winding gravel dirt road, and near the very end, up a small hill. Tucked away in the trees. As I'm pulling in the driveway, I see what clearly looks like somebody in a large werewolf costume, or a Hollywood prop, just above the back part of the house in the trees. It was there clear as day. I glanced at it, and kind of chuckled to myself that the neighbors must have stuck up a prop for fun and giggles. I pulled into the house, not thinking anything about it, and gave the folks a call. Fortunately, there was enough cell service to get a hold of her. They were running a tad bit behind and would be there within 10 minutes. No problem. I sat in my car and waited, double-checking I had everything I needed to give them if this was a property they wanted to pursue. Fast forward a little to them showing up. Lovely couple. We took about 45 minutes in total, checking out the whole property, the inside, the outside, you name it. When we got to the outside and were walking around, I immediately noticed the spot that I saw what I thought was an elaborate costume or Hollywood prop was now gone. It made me feel funny. Nobody is around us. The nearest neighbors were down the road, and they wouldn't have been able to get over here without us seeing them. Besides, why would they be walking around in a large werewolf costume on a hot day in June? That's when the husband, who was walking in front of me up the incline, exclaimed and asked me if there was large wild dogs living out here. He was pointing down at the ground, right where I had seen the prop beforehand. In the dirt were these incredibly large dog prints, larger than my hand. I had never seen prints so big before. He says to me, "Wow, the neighbors around here must have some big dogs." They just continued on as if all was normal, exploring up the hillside as the property reached out further and further. I couldn't help but feel so shaken about it, although I hid it. After the couple came back down, they spent a few more minutes taking quick last-minute looks all around the premise. They ended things on a, "Well, we'll discuss it more and get back to you if this is something we want to purchase." They drove off, and I was going to give the owner a call and to let him know how it went. Right as I'm pulling up his contact info on my phone, the nearby neighbor comes walking up to me from the road and starts a conversation with me about 30 feet away. He tells me if there's people moving in. I explained that I just showcased this property to that couple. He was disappointed they left when they did. He wanted to meet them, thinking they were going to be his new neighbors. That's when he started talking about large wolves in the area. That caught me off guard. I had to ask him what he was talking about. He was so calm and dismissive about the idea of giant wolves that walked on two legs. I asked him, "You mean like a werewolf?" He denied that, but said these were just large predatory animals that roamed the area. They've made several attempts to get inside his house and go after his cats and dogs. He wanted to thoroughly inform his new neighbors of this nuisance around the neighborhood, if this is where they were going to settle down at. He didn't leave much room for conversation, just kind of walked back to where he came as he waved and told me his goodbyes. The whole thing was just weird. I got back in my truck and drove away. The whole time I'm thinking that son of a gun, he's pulling a prank on me about the whole wolf thing. But my mind kept going to those prints in the dirt. There were no other prints. No boot, no feet, just extremely large dog prints. They were indented into the dirt too, pretty heavily. There's no way those could have just been put there easily. And they were fresh. I might be a wimpy girl, but I do know a thing or two about tracking and animal tracks, considering my daddy hunted a ton around this area, and I grew up here. People think that because I'm a woman, that I don't know nothing, but I do. You can take it or leave it. He might have very well been messing with me, but I don't know. The entire thing just felt so weird. If there is anything else that gives this wolf thing grounds to be real, is that I have some Native American friends from the surrounding areas. All of them have told me horrific tales about being stalked and attacked by what they believe to be a Bigfoot. Each one of them, on multiple occasions. I have no knowledge if there is any truth to them. Then again, I don't go around asking people if they've had any weird encounters, so I don't really know. This might have been nothing, but I can't be 100% sure. I'm surprised that I'm running this out, because I'm not the type of person to ever show interest in this subject, but I believe I saw some sort of aquatic sea creature that is either unknown to man or is part human in a sense. Before I go on, I'll give you some background information on me. I'm a professional photographer. I do lots of work for larger clients, and even have some of my work featured in magazines. For that record, I'm going to keep my identity concealed, because if my name gets out, attached to this, it might ruin me. I can't risk that. I've spent far too many years building up my repertoire. So, you can call me Ethan for short. Now, the time and place this event took was in 2016. I was visiting the chain of islands of Hawaii, doing some landscape photography of the coast and surrounding spots for a client that was working on a big project. I was out in the early morning hours on the beach of the southwestern side of Oahu. I was setting up to do some landscape shots of the ocean, getting my tripod just right, when to my left, I felt this weird sensation, like someone was looking at me. So I turned out of reaction, and I was astonished at what I saw. Standing out of the shallow water was a creature I can't begin to accurately describe to you. It was a bluish green, had scales covering the entire body, fins, was rather shorter and kind of stubby looking. It was standing there, about waist deep in the shallow water, just watching me set up my tripod. As soon as I noticed it, I yelled out of shock. It swiftly turned back toward the water and disappeared underneath the surface. It almost did like a belly flop, nose dive kind of thing. It was so fast I can't describe it. I have never seen a creature like this before in my life. It looked so human-like. I don't even have anything that comes to mind for me to give you a comparison, because there's nothing that looks like that. I didn't see its lower half, but it was very much so half man, half fish, or sea-like. It had a human-like face with black eyes. It didn't make any noise that I noticed. This thing was probably only about 20 feet away from me. I hadn't seen it because of the angle that I was facing setting up my equipment. Who knows how long it had been there, watching me. This happened during the early morning hours, just as the sun was rising, so I had a lot of visibility and clarity on what I saw. It was so smooth in its movements that after it disappeared back into the water, I tore down my equipment as fast as I could and changed locations for my shooting that day. The hardest part was creating an excuse as to why I couldn't shoot at that location, because my client wanted very specific pictures of that location that I was at. Luckily, I was able to create almost identical pictures at a different location without my client ever knowing. I was not going to go back to that spot at the beach. I don't know what was watching me, but it gave me the creeps. Had I known there's animals like that live in the water, I probably would have thought twice about going down to that spot on the beach. My work is ever going in my list of clients, and it doesn't stop. I have never had anything weird like that happen to me before, or since. With the 4th of July coming up, I have a very interesting tale for you that occurred about 4 or 5 years ago on the 4th of July. My father and I, and some other family and friends were boating out on a local lake. This is a rather large lake, and we were going around to the other side to find a better fishing spot. The time was about 1 p.m. in the afternoon. After we had found a good spot, we did some fishing. My dad booted up the motor again, and we went back to the original docking spot that we were at. Well, my dad noticed on the way back something. The rudder seemed to be acting weird. It wasn't fully functional like it was, and it was making a very odd smell, and sounded a bit weird. It would then have periods where it sounded functional again, or at least semi-functional. My father never thought much of it, but by the time we got to the end of the day and we were loading the boat back on the trailer out of the water, he saw the most horrific thing. Well, we all did. The reason the rudder had been making all those funky noises as we were on the boat, because something had gotten caught in the blade, jamming it partially when pulling on the engine and having it go multiple times. The rudder must have chopped up whatever this was, because its body was still partially stuck on the rudder. I don't know what it was, and I've never seen a fish like this. It had gills, but was very amphibian reptilian looking. It had a long body, black eyes, and a large gaping mouth with lots of sharp teeth. It was longer than my father, so probably about 8 feet in length. It wasn't an alligator gar, trust me. I know what those look like. Those are fish, and they definitely look like fish. This looked much more not fish-like, as I said. Very amphibious and reptilian looking. From what I saw, it kind of reminded me of a cross between a frog thing and an alligator, if that makes sense, but with a more eel-like body. It's really hard to describe. It doesn't help that it was pretty mutilated by the rudder blades of the boat, so what we were seeing was its partial body. It had arms though, whatever it was, and it looked like they were clung onto the rudder. It's like it was clung onto the bottom of the boat, right as he started up the engine, would be my guess. It was so freaky. Freaked my dad out, because he's done so much fishing. He ain't ever seen anything like that. My whole family saw it. Tried to convince him it was a sturgeon, but please, sturgeon don't look anything like this did. It was dark green and had patches of black on it. Very bizarre. I didn't take a picture, but I wish I would have. The head was still intact, partially, but its face was torn off, at least half of it, from the blade. Whatever it was large. I forgot to mention more about its face. It had a very short, protruding mouth. Not quite a snout, but very reptile-like, I thought, or that's the way it looked. The teeth were sharp and in great numbers, but they too looked more reptile-like than fish. Fish teeth are sharp, but these resembled shark teeth, kind of. It's hard to explain. You would have to have seen it to know what I meant. It took my dad about an hour or two to try and fully pry this thing off of his rudder, so it was completely disengaged. The more chunks of meat he ripped off his rudder, the nastier it was. Very clumpy looking meat. I've had alligator meat before, and it kind of reminded me of that. It's just one of those things that you look back on as something unexplainable. So, this story happened last summer. We have lawn parties every year at my mom's house on the lake. This particular one got pretty crazy, and I ended up real tipsy. But when I drink, I get hyped up, and everything just seems like a good idea. We all kept jokingly saying, "Yeah, we're all gonna go swimming later." As the night drew on, I was warm from running all over the place, so I said, "Okay, time to swim." Everyone laughed, but I was set on it. I probably had the most to drink that night, so no one else could be convinced. I didn't care though. Something about alcohol just makes you feel fearless, even though I knew there were eels around the lake at night, which would usually terrify me sober. I got to the wharf and slowly slipped into the water, and it was a great night to swim. They threw me a life jacket just to be on the safe side. I just sat on in and grabbed my drink. I floated around laughing while they all snapped pictures of me. After a few minutes of fun, all of it wore off and I was a little creeped out. So I got out and we went on with the rest of the night, having a great time. The next morning, we cooked a big breakfast and talked about how fun the night was and how crazy I was for going out into the water. So goes the routine of looking through all the pictures of the night before and uploading them onto social media. Everyone was spread out between the kitchen, dining room, and living room, but the house seemed oddly quiet for how many people were there, and they all started handling their phones to one another, pointing at something. So right away, I was thinking, no way, they had some really embarrassing pictures of me. But nobody was laughing. I was confused. Then they handed me the phone and asked, "Do you see anything weird in this picture?" It didn't seem like anything at first, but then I saw it. It looked like figures of people standing around me while I floated there in the lake. I was kind of freaked out, but I thought it could just be fog. I'll look through the rest. I flipped to the next one and examined it. What I saw was in the picture. I zoomed in and looked for an excuse for it, but I can't explain it, and everybody else saw it too. It looked like a horned creature just emerging from the water right in front of me. I had the chills and am so creeped out just reliving this. I'll never swim in that lake again, especially at night. I recently read a BFR report, and I felt the need to add my own experience in the same area. I too was a Forest Service employee for the Plumas County in the 90s. I don't know the original author. I hiked to the bottom of the Middle Fork drainage where the Pacific Crest Trail crosses the river from the Quincy side, north side, so I could brush it out, and cut some poles and logs laying across the trail. First day, I had a couple of guys with me, and we knocked out a good portion of it that day. I came back later in the week to finish up the remaining few miles by myself. The tactic is to go down the trail heavy with water and saw gas and work your way back to getting lighter. I worked my way down the trail, maybe about 2.5 hours to the area where we left off. I started cutting my way back up the trail. The logs were spread apart, with patches of down logs and then areas of clear trail for several minutes of hiking. In the periods where I shut the saw off, I soon started to realize I was getting side-hilled by something that was downslope of me off the trail, maybe about 100 to 150 feet just inside the tree line. As I moved up the trail, it did also. If it was a lion, I would have never heard it, and bears are very noisy coming through the brush. This was not wildlife. This was clearly a bipedal footfall. By the time most of my work was done, I was getting a little spooked, and I just wanted to get back to the landing where my truck was parked. Unfortunately, I never got eyes on it, so I can't give you a visual account. I was only able to occasionally see saplings move. To be perfectly honest, I was too afraid to look. I had my head down, humping gear up the trail. I was light and moving at a good clip on a trail. This thing was easily able to outpace me, even though it was working through steep rocky brush and tree-covered terrain. At times it got ahead of me because of the contour of the land, and that was a little bit horrifying. This thing was agile and fast. This went on for a couple of hours. About a half hour from my truck, I stopped hearing anything. I feel I was being escorted out of the area. The whole experience was very unnerving. What bothers me the most is I don't know how long I was being watched for. I was running the chainsaw intermittently with earplugs in. I'm sure the three of us were being watched on the previous trip. We just couldn't hear anything with the saws running. I've spent a lot of time in the woods and still do in a professional capacity, but that was a new one. If anybody is thinking this is a person, I'll tell you right now, there is no flippin' way. We had a perfectly clear Class A Bigfoot Sasquatch sighting. Thursday, August 29th, 2019. 10 a.m. approximately. Northwest British Columbia. Highway 37, south of the Nass River Bridge. Very remote area with a construction mustering site nearby. Distance, about 50 yards. We were driving from Hyder, Arkansas in our motorhome. The Sasquatch came out of the woods, crossed 2 lanes of highway in perfect sight, and disappeared into the woods. Both my wife and I saw it. I still get chills describing the event. Based on our seated height in our motorhome, I would estimate the height at over 7 feet tall, walking almost completely erect. It never looked either way or hesitated before crossing the highway. It was intent in its purpose. Dark brown hair from head to foot. Chest was flat. broad strides and long arms, but not ape-like. I couldn't stop as there was no shoulder to pull on, and the traffic that was present was limited to a large tandem logging trucks traveling at high rates of speed. I barely slept that night, trying to process what we saw, what it was or wasn't. If only I would have purchased that Dashcam for our Alaskan trip. I feel fortunate in having seen this, and retelling the story brings a great deal of interesting response. The show is all that more interesting since I know they are out there. Having researched the subject further, the one we saw looked most closely to the Patterson-Gimlin photo, except our view was a complete profile only. I was accompanied by my wife and 15-year-old son. We had built a fire when the sun had set. I mentioned to my wife that Sasquatches are known to answer howls. I am on the BFRO site 4 days a week to track sightings, and am a firm believer after reading Dr. Meldrum's book, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science. I made a howl like the 1994 Moaning Howl Ohio call recording on this site. I am a trained vocalist and can project my voice loudly. I cupped my face and let out a howl. It was answered. I was facing east and let out a howl every 30 to 60 seconds that was answered progressively closer. Astonished, I kept it up, and the return was always closer. My wife fled into the RV in fear. My son would not come out. I was not in fear, but in hopes of seeing a Sasquatch. I did not have my cell phone with me to record the Sasquatch returning howls. I grabbed my .44 Magnum revolver, just in case, and a flashlight, skinning the trees in hopes to see an illuminated red pair of eyes. As soon as I had my pistol in my hand, there were no more returning howls. I was never in fear, but in awe. There must have been 10 to 12 howls and returns. With the first reply, I would guess that the Sasquatch at least a mile away, and with the last, maybe a quarter mile to an eighth of a mile, if not closer. On June 30th, 2020, we returned home, and I had my wife and I and son listen to the 1994 Ohio howls. They were shocked that that was exactly what they had heard. If you haven't heard it, be sure to check out bfro.net and check out the 1994 Ohio howls. I was visiting my family's former home and treated myself with a night's stay at the cottages. They lie along the road, running from Deadwood to Rockford. The campgrounds was empty save for me. Even the proprietor was not home. They have beautiful pastures and a huge assortment of farm life, from turkeys to quail to goats and llamas, donkeys and horses. Their fields run right up to the forest, probably not even a football field's length away. I was sitting outside, watching their antics and enjoying the evening air. Suddenly, something started to howl in the woods to the west. Everything alive in the place froze in the same moment, and all their heads, mine included, swiveled toward the sound. I cannot begin to describe it, but I had grown up in these hills and know it was nothing I could identify. The sound was somewhere between a howl and a scream, and just echoed. It went on for 3 to 5 minutes, and every creature stopped to listen. I didn't hear it again while there. I didn't tell anybody when I saw them next. Since then, I've listened to recordings to try and identify the sound, and the recent recording by the hunter out of Canada is an exact match. That's what impelled me to report it. I was driving home from work in the afternoon and completely preoccupied with my thoughts of my struggles when my eyes caught something. However, my mind was still not focused other than I was waiting for movements of sorts. It's second nature to keep an eye out for deer in this area. When I finally noticed that I was looking at something unusual, I saw a tall, hairy animal walking off into the woods on 2 feet from the road. It had long blonde to light brown hair all over. I never saw the face. I kept my eyes focused on the woods where it walked into. When I reached that spot, I was completely shocked at the size that the creature was. It had to be at least 9 to 10 feet tall. The only thing I could think of was Bigfoot. Quick note, I have never been a believer of Bigfoot before, but what I saw that day is something I can't stop thinking about. There were several cars in front of me too. There could have been other witnesses. One reason I noticed the Bigfoot was because the traffic was slowing down. It is second nature in this area to be aware of wildlife, so I was looking for a possible deer on the road when I noticed it. It was around 4 to 5 p.m. with good lighting, and it was mostly sunny or a clear day. The sunlight was not direct enough to cast shadows though. It was perfect lighting for a photo shoot. I was on the Little Miami bike trail, heading back to Morrow from Oregonia, mile marker 23.5. It was Sunday, April 12th, around 5 p.m. in the afternoon. Since the COVID restrictions were enacted a week or two prior, the trail had become so crowded every day of the week. However, a cold front came in, and it was a cool, cloudy day, and very few people on the trail. Maybe 20 riders encountered from Oregonia to Kings Mill. Well, maybe more, but not bad. I'm retired and ride this route nearly daily, weather permitting. So after passing under the former Jeremiah Morrow Bridge, I-71, over Little Miami River, there's a long, gentle arc in the trail. I haven't seen a soul since I turned around at Wilmington Road. I'm cruising. It's nice and quiet, when suddenly, I heard a loud knock. So distinct that I instantly said in my head, that was a knock. It came from atop the hill to the east. I pondered all the conditions. Kids playing, not. Cold, remote, and they don't play in the woods anymore. Adult messing, maybe. But how would they know I was there? Natural, very doubtful. I'm nearly 68 and never heard anything so crisp, clear, like a Louisville slugger full speed against a barkless solid ash tree, or so I imagined. Therefore, that's what happened. I look online to see if any Bigfoot sightings had been reported in this area, and found none. I stored the incident away until last weekend when I was talking to my son. He's 46 in May. I raised him near Morrow. Our school district includes the Mainville area. One of his good friends lived on a hillside at a 90-degree curve on a nearby road. His friend and his older brother, 20 years ago, he and his dad both saw a Bigfoot walking through the woods on the opposing side, 2 different times. The older brother said he never related this until he told me, because of my knock story. He said he'll never forget it. And because of his story, I tell you my story. Thank you for reading. This story I got is one that I am very proud of. I actually got it from talking to an old man about his experiences because he lived through a very intense UFO-logical case. The year was 1977, and I was 14 years old. I used to live with my mother, dad, and my sister in a house. We lived in a city in Brazil. My dad used to work as a construction worker in the city, and he also had a corn farm away from there. The city was small, had a little more than 1,000 people. We used to go to the school by morning, and the school was inside the church. I would go out and play with my friends in the afternoon, and we would still be there, playing until nighttime. There were other small villages around, and the kids from these villages would join us too. It all started mid-August. Me and 5 of my friends were walking in a region we called the beach. The beach was a place somewhat far away from the city, surrounded by woods. We used to go there sometimes. We would start a fire and sit around it to tell each other stories. We had some dogs with us that day. All of a sudden, we started to smell something strange. It was like this weird chemical smell. The dogs then started to bark in the direction of the woods. We all looked at the tree line, trying to see something big. Me and one of my friends stood up, and we got 2 big sticks we would leave around the place for emergencies. The dogs got more and more agitated. We then saw some movement in the woods. The dogs ran in the direction of the movement, and before we could do anything, they disappeared in the darkness. We tried following them, but they were too fast, and their barks would get more and more distant. The noises then stopped. We kept running. We eventually found the dogs, all dead. They all had that chemical smell, and one of them had this weird transparent goo in his mouth. They also didn't have any injuries. I remember that I cried a lot that night. One of the dogs was mine, and I really liked it. Some weeks later, everything was normal. I was at my house sleeping. I woke up in the middle of the night. I heard 2 or 3 cars accelerating through the road in front of my house. I found it a bit weird, but thought nothing more of it. I went to sleep again. At morning, I got ready for school. And as soon as I opened the door, 2 of my friends were waiting for me. They started telling me what happened during the night. Apparently, one of the villages got attacked by some sort of light. I didn't believe them at first. However, when we went by the only clinic in town, there were more people than usual in front of it. One girl was sitting in front of the clinic, crying. We knew that girl. She would sometimes play with us, and she was from another village. We quickly went to her and asked her what happened. She then told us a story that gave me goosebumps. Apparently, everything was okay until 11 p.m. The people of her house were at the living room talking. Suddenly, they hear some commotion outside. As they went to see, there were some people pointing at the skies. So they looked up as well. She said they could see some weird lights in the sky. They were almost round and would illuminate some of the clouds near it. She got scared by it and decided to go back home. As she was getting back, a huge flash of light illuminated the village. She ran inside and hid, meanwhile listening to people screaming outside. The flashes would continue, and a buzz sound would fill the air. Then, it finally stopped. She heard her dad coming inside with her mom, both in pain. After that, some of the people from the village went around to check on everyone. Her mom and dad were vomiting in the living room when the people came. They got everybody in a car and took them all to the hospital. That story scared me and my friends. We all got to school later, and all of our friends looked weirded out as well. A quick question, and they told us they knew about what had happened too. We had classes with the priest as normal, and later we went home. After lunch, me and my friends decided to go around a bit. You could see a change in the atmosphere of town. People were scared about what happened. We then went to the beach again, me and my friends, and as we used to do, we stayed there until night. The moon was illuminating the sky and reflecting on the river. Then, we heard a weird noise over in the distance. Suddenly, a big shadow covers the moon. When we looked up, we couldn't move from so much fear. Right on top of us, there was this black thing. A huge, dark ellipsoid with lights underneath it. It was big and standing still on top of us. One of my friends screams and we start running into the woods. We hid ourselves in a sort of cave, unaware if this thing was really after us. We stood there for a while. After we decided it was safe, we went running into town again. As soon as we got next to it, we could hear something was wrong, as we could hear screams in the distance. As we got to it, some people were crying and screaming in the streets. I quickly ran to my house. As I got there, my dad was going out of my house holding my mom. I immediately helped him carrying my mother, who was crying in pain. We went to the hospital. When we got there, a lot more people were there too. The one medic was running side to side, trying to calm people down. In the light of the hospital, I could talk to my dad about what had happened. He said that they heard a noise outside and stayed inside in fear. People could see the light in the sky again. When the flashes started, they were inside. Apparently, a flash came from a hole on the roof and got to my mom. Where the flash hit her, there were 2 needle-like holes. The area where the flash just hit was marked and had black marks in it. As more people would come in, I would hear around people talking about the injuries. Apparently, the injuries were all almost exact to each other. Even the people who got totally exposed by the flashes, all they had was 2 needle-like holes and some black marks. When it was finally dawn, my father gathered some friends and they went to the mayor's house. It was at this point in the hospital that I heard the name for the first time. They were calling these flashes Chupa Chupa because some people reported that the light was sucking blood from them. The days passed and more places started reporting the incident. People would light big bonfires at the main square in fear of the flashes. Then the military arrived and they set up camp near the town. I had seen guns before, but nothing quite like that. They had this big anti-air gun. It was installed in the middle of the base. This didn't stop things from happening. Every day, more and more people were attacked. The feeling of hopelessness finally made a good part of the town move away. Me and my family went to a village at around 40 kilometers from the city. We had a small farm there where my dad used to grow corn. We thought we would be safe there, and I had to quit school because of the whole ordeal. So my routine through the day was, I would help my dad during the day, and I would hang out with some kids from the neighborhood later. Things were pretty calm for a week, until one day, when the lights came. I was at my home with my parents, and we had to hide from the flashes under a big table in the kitchen. Some of the other families weren't so lucky and got hit by them. My dad took it upon himself to take some of the people to the town hospital. The next day, he didn't come home. I tended to the farm as usual, waiting for him to come back. Later, I got on my bicycle and went around to the other kids. We went pretty far from town. When it was almost dark, we were already going back and saw my dad's car going back to the road. He didn't stop, as we were all going back together, me and the other kids. The thing is, all the kids would go home, and I would have to ride another 12 minutes until I got home. It was dark already, and I was alone about halfway home. Then, I saw the lights in the sky, and the flashes started. This time, as I was riding my bike, I didn't have a single space to hide from the flashes. As soon as the first flash hit me, I fell to the ground, paralyzed. I couldn't move nor scream, and I felt the pain of the flashes scorching my skin. When the lights stopped, I got up. 2 holes were open near my neck, and I had black marks all over me. I went home, stumbling here and there from pain. That was about the last straw for my father. He got me in the car and went to the hospital with me. There, at least 3 more people were waiting, all victims of the flashes. All the family had to stay in the church while they waited for me to get treated. I spent the next day in the hospital, as I had more wounds from the bicycle fall. At that night, we heard strange noises while in the hospital. It all started with a weird buzz. I recognized it from that day at the beach and started crying. Suddenly, another noise, a helicopter. It went by the city really fast. Sometime later, a loud noise. I never heard an anti-air gun before, but from the noise, I knew it was the thing firing at something. Then, everything got quiet. We went back to the farm the next day. We could see the remaining people of the town were all on edge for what happened the other day. At this point, it was at the end of February. Like a week later, the military went back to the capital. For some time in the next months, we would still see the lights, but the flashes that used to hurt us were gone. The town went back to normal then. So, I grew up in this town, and in 1989, my father passed away. I then went to live in the corn farm, in the small house we had there. The house wasn't big, but it had everything I needed. I used to tend the crops during the day and made a chicken coop. One night, I was almost asleep, but suddenly, the dogs started barking outside. I had these big dogs for protection. I stood up from my bed, got my gun, and went to check outside. I could hear something moving on the cornfield. As I got outside, I started to smell something weird. A chemical smell. I stood outside in the front door, looking at the movement on the cornfield. Something then blocks the light of the moon. I look up. I see the same black shape I had seen years ago. When I look back down again, I could see a thing. A small humanoid figure, thin, had about 1.5 meters tall. It had a brownish pale skin, big head, big bulgy black eyes. When I looked at it, felt a strong headache. I twisted myself and managed to get inside my house and close the door. I was so scared that I even ended up pissing myself. I then sat at the corner of the living room, gun pointed at the door. The dogs kept barking outside. I saw shadows passing in front of the window, but I refused to look at them. I stood there until I could see the light of the moon again, and the smell disappeared. I got up, ran in my car, and drove all the way to my sister's house at the Capitol. I went back there to get my stuff, but I would never ever live near that region again. A friend of mine still lives there. He says that from time to time, he can still see the lights in the sky. So, in about 2012, my then boyfriend lived in Sweden. I live in Canada. He came to visit me, and during one of the evenings, I woke up to something strange perched at the foot of the bed. It was a pale, thin humanoid figure. It was completely hairless, and the legs seemed to be bowed in some way. It seemed to walk on all fours, despite looking human. I couldn't see much of its face since it was looking away from me. It looked a lot like the creature from the fictional story, The Rake. When I gasped, it hopped off the bed and into the darkness. My partner heard me and woke to ask me what was wrong. I didn't tell him as to not alarm him while trying to rest. In 2014, he was visiting once more, and we were once again in bed sleeping. I woke up to hear my boyfriend screaming like I've never heard before. I immediately turned on the light and shook him to try and snap him out of it, but he just screamed and then cried. After 30 or so minutes, he finally was calm enough to explain what had happened. Apparently, he woke up to a pale humanoid figure with a gaping mouth and black sunken eyes, basically on top of him. As he screamed, the figure slowly backed itself into the closet, whole, staring at him, crawling on all fours. I felt sick. I never ever told him about what I saw a few years prior. There's no way he could have known and described what I saw perfectly like that. Now, here's why I'm telling you this. It's shown up again. My ex messaged me today, since we're still friends, and told me his now girlfriend has seen the pale man. They were asleep, and apparently, she woke up to see this thing stalking around the room, and it noticed her, frozen in fear, so it crawled up next to her. My ex woke up and tried to console her. She described what she saw. It apparently was perfect exact match to the thing we both saw. I only ever told him what I saw after his experience, and she has never ever heard of either of our experiences. Is this just a mass coincidence of hallucination? Or is this a demon or some sort of haunting? A skinwalker? A crawler? I'm really freaked out. Names and details leading up to this encounter aren't very important, so I'll just set the scene. Two 14-year-old girls go on an isolated Kentucky mountaintop a few hours after I flipped the ATV, injuring my friend's leg. I had tried to act quickly, but I was too weak to get the ATV upright by myself. Once the both of us lifted it, we promptly flooded the engine. A woman of action, I helped my friend up, put it in neutral, and decided to push the ATV down the mountain, with my friend occasionally tapping the brake. Suddenly, she halts our progress and asks me to jump on the back. In front of us was a monster of a snake. It was the fattest, angriest hog snake I've ever seen, right across our path. blocking us. By this time, it was almost dusk. Because the snake was easily the size of my arm, we decided to just stare it down, waiting on for it to crawl. Finally, I could push again, though I wasn't thrilled about walking next to this lazy flat goblin. I didn't have a long way to go, and we'd be able to coast on down, or maybe my parents would come searching for us. There was still plenty of light, but the sky was pink from sunset. Simultaneously, our heads snapped to look behind us. I'm not entirely sure why we even looked. There wasn't a sound, no twig snap. It had to be something instinctual, because we both looked back at the tree-lined path that we'd slowly come through. Every hair that I owned raised. My blood ran cold in an instant. I spared one quick glance at my friend, mostly because I hadn't seen it yet. She had. She was completely frozen, and I followed her gaze to about 15 feet behind me. There sat this creature, hunched over, boneless, yet with some humanoid form. It was skin, pale white skin. At first, I thought that's all it was, like Buffalo Bill or Gollum. Then barely a second after that panicked observation, I noticed its face, its eyes. They were so deeply set that I at first was terrified of the glance. I thought they were only empty black pits. The setting sun struck them just enough that I could see the refraction. Its nose was flatter than Voldemort's. This hunched, naked, pale creature was studying me just the same. Its lips were pale, pink, and trembling. A horrifying thought informed me that this gaunt creature was famished, starving, hungry. As if it heard my inner dialogue, it raised its skin-wrapped, skeletal hand to silence me. Then, it waved its claws one finger at a time. I wished that I had counted them, but I was trying desperately not to piss myself. Then, the sweetest sound that I'd ever heard. The ATV started. My friend, the angel, must have turned away long enough to try it, so I risked it as well. I leapt onto the back of the ATV, sobbing, and wrapped my arms around my buddy so tightly. That's probably the reason for her cracked rib, and not the accident. When I glanced back, it was gone. Halfway down the mountain, we ran into my parents. It was pitch black. We survived, and talked about it later at the hospital. Turns out, she didn't even know how to start the ATV. It wasn't her. It's been a few years since this happened. I haven't been back on the mountain. I'm still friends with her, and we've talked about it a few times. We've theorized various possibilities as to what it could have been, but we can't agree. I've tried to find similar encounters, even in mythology. Finally, I'm here. I'm sure that I've not explained it very well, but I did my best to try. Do you have any ideas about what it is? Did it want to eat me or help us? We both saw it, so at least I know I'm not crazy. I remember these experiences I had as a 5 to 6-year-old. I usually slept in my own room before I became a paranoid child. I had a twin-sized bed in my old house. The door to my room was about 10 feet to my left of the bed. Between the ages of 5 and 6, maybe 7, I had numerous experiences with 2 different, I don't know what to say, ghosts? Demons? I really don't know. It started after what I thought was just a disturbingly vivid reoccurring dream. I'm a lucid dreamer, and when I was little, I could wake up by screaming, and this might sound funny, but when I did, a skeleton head would reappear out of nowhere and shake me until I woke up. It went like this. It would be either late evening or midnight, and the fish nightlight I had would be a little dimmer than usual. I was always freezing cold, but not winter cold. Like the cold you get when you're playing frisbee on a cool summer day. A chilly arm cold. I would always hear a creepy hum, like 10 seconds before she showed up. A lady, a tall, thin, hunched-over lady wearing a dress in a color I couldn't identify, would open the door. And her hair, it would be covering her face. She would walk around for a bit, and I would just sit, like literally frozen in fear. Anytime I would try and scream, nothing came out. and she would notice and jump at me. I would always wake up in a cold sweat. That kept happening for about a year. It slowed down after 6 months because of one occurrence. It was like an out-of-body experience, but with ghosts. I would start in my parents' room and float over down the hallway to my room. I would float up until I was right above my bed, and I saw a shadow of a man, like he was made of nothing, like 8 foot, and his arms went down to his knees. He was almost twig thin, and he was bald. He was looking down at my body, like he was checking to see if I was okay, and he stiffened up after a few seconds and slowly looked up at me where I was, and he had no face. After that, I woke up. When I was like 9, a few months before we moved, my dad told me he met a woman who knocked on our door for no reason. She told him 2 people died in our house. One, a man who had had a heart attack, and a woman who fell down the stairs and broke her neck. I can't make this up. Now I'm in the 8th grade. I need answers as to what this could be. If a crawler like mimicked their bodies or they possessed them. I don't really know. Okay, I want to preface this by saying I have had a lot of stuff happen to me on my grandparents' land. It's 75 acres of horror, and if you're not used to it, I grew up a lot, so this didn't faze me too much. So if my reactions are odd, it's because this is my life, and I'm kind of desensitized. No, this is not the only thing to chase after me in my car, but this one was different. Anyway, okay, I was 17 years old, driving from my dad's house on the before-mentioned land. Pretty late. I think it was around 11 or so. I had dropped somebody off at my dad's house and was driving back into town to get to my mom's place. As I was driving down our long driveway, I kept seeing things move in the field. I didn't pay any attention. Probably a rabbit or something. Things moving in the grass is normal. I get out to the road, and I see something or someone in the ditch, just lying there. Me being a girl in a raggedy old car, at a place with piss poor signal, in the middle of the night with no weapons on me, I floor it. I don't care. I figured I could call my dad later to take care of the possible drunk in the ditch. I'm driving down the road, memory of the ditch person creeping me out, and I get this awful feeling of being watched. I'm traveling down this road at nearly 60 miles an hour, no signal whatsoever. Maybe I'm just overreacting. Whatever. I still speed up because I want to get signal to call my boyfriend, because it would make me feel safer. Then I see something running alongside my car. Well, I say running. It was more skittering. Lanky limbs, on all fours, running and keeping up with me, going 60 plus miles an hour down a country logging highway. I think my brain kind of had an aneurysm at this point, because I'm just repeating myself. What? I'm getting closer to civilization though, so I floor it, getting up to 80 miles an hour and leaving it behind. I call my boyfriend, freaking out about what I saw. I pulled over at a little church with the light out front, trying to logic it all out, when I see the thing again. It's on the road, skittering towards my parked car. Before I have time to pull out, it's on me, hitting my car hard enough to dent the rear bumper. I scream, squealing out of the lot, and driving like a maniac towards town. I get into town and circle around the main areas a few times, calming down before I go to my mom's. Further description of the thing. It was weirdly flat, like someone trying to do a back bend, but not bending. Its limbs were long and spindly, with pale skin stretched too tight across its bones. My personal encounters with the infamous demon Zozo. In the late summer of 2017 began a strange phase in my life that led to a sequence of paranormal events that haunt me to this day and will forever haunt me. From about August to October is the timeline of these events. I started watching these videos on YouTube about stupid 3 a.m. challenges, knowing that most of them were fake. However, a few really did intrigue me. One, known as the Closet Game, especially in the use of a Ouija board. In my garage, I played the closet game with this small room within the garage. Nothing really worked, but I do recall always getting bad vibes from that room ever since then. I started playing with an Ouija board first, with friends. I then started playing it alone to see if it would work. I know you are never supposed to play these alone, and I still did. I played so often, talking to many different entities. Eventually, I started talking to Zozo. I knew Zozo was bad from the get-go. I've seen all about him on YouTube and read up extensively, doing my own research on what the name was based from and why they use it. I say they because I believe that Zozo is not a real name. I believe that it's a trick name bad spirits use to gain power. I eventually became obsessed with the board and Zozo, speaking to him almost every day and night, just casually laughing as he threatened me, knowing that he really couldn't do much. That's what I thought at least. However, I started noticing some changes. One night, I decided to play the Ouija board in the room that I played the closet game in. After all, it did give me bad vibes, so I, being the idiot that I am, decided sure. As I played in this room by myself, there sat an old TV that was not plugged in. I could see my own reflection, somewhat cloudy in the TV, but it was easy to make out features of myself. I began to play the board, and as always, Zozo appeared. Whenever I would talk to him, I never had fear. I knew that he was a demon. I believe he knew that I knew this, and the fact is that I was still talking to him, and it made me somewhat calmer. He was always very calm with me, and when I would ask questions, he would respond respectfully. Me and him would tease each other often. I asked where he was sitting, and the planchette pointed directly in front of me, where the TV was. I asked if he could do something in some way to show himself to me, and he moved swiftly to yes. I quickly asked what he was going to do, and the planchette moved to the center of the board and forward. I didn't understand at first, but I realized that he was pointing. I looked up at the TV and watched in horror, disbelief, and awe as my reflection began to morph into this horrific creature. It somewhat still held some of my features, for example, my hair and clothes. However, the eyes went pitch black, looking like holes. It was like staring into a deep abyss. The eyes were not just circular, they seemed like they were dripping almost. The darkness slowly dripping out and down out of the reflection's eyes. The mouth was, hilariously enough, exactly like the Scream mask. It looked horrific, but also cliché, so I'm not sure if this was genuinely an experience or not, but it was very interesting to say the least. On another day, my friend came over and me and him were smoking in my garage. I know again that you are never supposed to play the Ouija board in an altered state of mind, but at this point, I did not know that Zozo had influence over me. I go to play the board, asking if my friend wanted to join. He politely refused, and I played alone again, talking with Zozo. I got bored, of course, because I always talk to Zozo, and decided to just put the board away. I got out my box of knives, and he was showing my friend my collection. We started feeling this weird energy in the air, like static. You know when you feel static electricity pulling your hair towards it? It was like that everywhere. I thought it was just me, so funnily, went to touch my friend to shock him. However, it didn't work. He was also feeling this static energy, and as quick as it went, it seemed to vanish. I started spacing out after this. Apparently, I had grabbed one of my knives and very slowly put it to my neck and started leaning my head on it, as if I was about to slice my own throat. When I came to, I felt the knife pressed against my neck and was confused. My friend paying attention and on the computer. At that moment, I knew immediately that I could no longer play the board. I promised myself that I would never play it again and put it away in my closet. I, about 3 times a week, would find myself unaware, reaching for the board, even though I promised I would never play this. This is when I realized I was under demonic influence. I have since cleansed myself of this and am okay now, but I still have one more story. One night, I was sneaking out of my house and I went to hop the gate that leads into the alleyway so I can get out of my backyard. Once I hopped the gate, I started walking out of the alley when I extremely distinctly heard in a loud whisper, "Come back," in a sinister tone. I screamed like a little girl and ran in my car to get out of there. The very same night, once I got home, at around 3 in the morning, at the time I wasn't aware it was 3, I decided to open my third eye in my bathroom. A lot of people have their opinions about whether it works or not, and I'm fully aware that people have their doubts, and that's okay, because I didn't believe it at first either, but it does work. Anyway, back to the point. I was opening my third eye, and right when I felt the energy very furiously tingling my forehead as it opened, I heard a demonic laugh. 3 little laughs that sounded like they were from a horrific creature. I ran out of the bathroom and felt a malicious energy behind me. I ran to my room and closed my eyes and prayed so hard to ask God to forgive me because I did something that I shouldn't have, and asked him for help. Immediately, I felt the horrible energy dissipate. I haven't dabbled in the paranormal much since, but I do still have odd occurrences here and there. Thank you for hearing my story. This happened back in the fall of 2017. My family had my younger sister's friend living with us for over a year. For this story, my sister's name will be named M, and her friend will be named L. One evening, Elle decided to go hang out in Sylvan Lake, Alberta. She hung out with a couple of very sketchy people who M and I didn't like that much. So, she went out around the lake with her friends. They stopped over at the lighthouse right on the lake and decided it was wise to mess around with a Ouija board. And they knew the rules were not to mention the name of anybody you knew or loved. Elle's friend, who I'll call Jack, had the nerve to say my sister's name out loud while the portal was opened. Elle got pissed at Jack and said how wrong that was of him to say her best friend's name during their time with the Ouija board. So they decided to close the portal after that, 'cause he knew better. Later that same night, M had one of her episodes of sleep paralysis, and they were a pretty regular thing to occur for her. Well, this episode in particular was an interesting one. She woke up, and she knew this was happening because she could not move at all. During her episode, she started to hear faint whispering in her room. She could not move or see what was going on. Then the whispering got way louder. She moved her eyes to the other side of her room, and she saw these porcelain china dolls all around her room. She saw them, and as she looked at them, the dolls turned their heads and looked at her really quickly. She then felt her hair being pulled back into a ponytail, and her head started to lift up. The whispering got even louder, and she felt constant breezes around her. Then, the whole thing stopped, and M fell out of her sleep paralysis and got it together. Her head fell back into her pillow, and the whispering abruptly stopped. The next morning, M explained her episode of sleep paralysis to Elle, and then Elle explained how she played around with the Ouija board and how Jack said her name during this session. My sister lost it on Elle and told her to never play with the Ouija board again as long as she's living with us. Does anybody think there was some sort of connection between the Ouija board and her sleep paralysis episode? Because that's straight up freaky, and my sister and I just brought up this story to my parents. Let me say that Elle stopped hanging out with that group of people after what had happened. Is it possible that those occurrences were related? Any information or input about that story would be great. Thank you for listening to my sister's story. This took place when I was 14 years old, camping in a little area of land in western Maryland where lots of my mom's family had little cabins. This was in the middle of nowhere, on private property, and everyone on the mountain was related to us one way or another. We grew up spending the summers around the campfire, telling scary stories and running around with all of my cousins. Quick explanation of layout. Imagine a large capital T for a road. Above the T, by 150 feet, ran Savage River. If you went left on the T, it would take you past multiple family house, but also dense forest that cut off the road. If you went all the way to the right of the T, was my mom's tiny cabin, where we stayed. I often went off on my own, preferring it that way. I was about to do just that when my aunt had asked me to tag along. She's 14 years older than I am, and a big kid. She had pink in her hair at the time, covered in tattoos, and is almost 6 feet tall. So, not easily intimidated. So I had decided that we'd go all the way to the left into the dense forest, and she's fine with that, admitting that she had come with me so she could smoke a joint and keep out of eyesight of my disapproving grandmother. Now, I was a good kid. Even though she offered me a hit, the thought of drugs still scared me, so I declined. From the end of the road was a super rough dirt path into the woods, with the river still running 150 feet above the path. If you were to walk towards the river, it goes on a downward slope. A few miles in, you'll actually come across one of those legendary random staircases that led to nowhere. On this particular day, I had taken the dirt path and had walked down the 150 feet along the river, watching the fish and crawdads scurry as my aunt got high as a kite, a little bit behind me. I was in my own little world when I suddenly heard a click noise that brought me back to reality. I look up and around, confused. Then my eyes land on some man that I've never seen before, standing across the river from me, no more than 15 feet from me. He must have just walked out of the woods on the other side of the river. It's summer, but he's in a black jacket and raggedy jeans and is holding one of those old cheap non-digital yellow cameras that you would roll the top and click it to be able to take another picture. I was stunned because I had never seen anyone other than my family anywhere around the area in all the years that I'd been going up there. He smiled at me slightly, lowering his camera. He was older, probably 40s, and very scruffy, tall and kinda thin. He takes a step forward, and I turn to take a step back. He scrolls the top of the camera and points it directly at me again. I am literally at the loss of words and can only manage to take another step back, almost slipping on a rock as I do. That's when my aunt stumbles through the trees and is in mid-sentence about how much she missed being high when she stopped and stared at the man. I was just staring at her, at this point, frozen like a deer in the headlights. I slowly turn, and he's not looking at my aunt. He's staring right at me. He clicks the camera again at us, and then he does something that makes my blood run cold and turns the situation from weird to terrifying. He does the tut-tut-tut thing with his finger and points to what looks like a knife sheathed and strapped to his hip, and then points a finger that he slices across his throat. That's the moment that I went into autopilot. I spun around and began barreling through the trees, grabbing onto my aunt. My heart pounded as I ran, though I could have sworn I heard one more click before I could hear the splashing from behind me. I almost collapsed because my legs felt like jelly. The river is really deep in parts, but where I had been, we're at a point where the water would have been only thigh deep to a grown man. I tore upwards and ran blindly, like a rabbit from a fox. When we saw the stairs, my aunt quickly yanked me to the other side and slid down beside me as we caught our breath. I was wheezing so loud, I had to cover my mouth to try and muffle the sound. I peer around, but the trees are so dense, I can't see the river from the stairs. But even with my hammering heartbeat, I hear the snapping of branches, like someone barreling through the forest. Now, I am very, very scared. It's not an easy straight trail back into my family property. You have to weave around, and in spots, it dips and gets rocky, so you have to do like an S shape to get through. There's random rocks everywhere, and it would be so easy to twist an ankle or to smack into a tree in my panic. Not to mention, we would always tread careful and look where we were going because there are so many snakes in that area. I'm sobbing and wheezing badly, and we had another few miles until we'd even hit the first part of my family's property. My mind is racing, but I know we can't stay. Neither of us had any type of weapon, and staying here was making it harder for me to convince myself to run as paralyzing terror crept in. My legs and arms already cut up, and before I can decide what to do, my aunt pulls me towards the T road, desperately, just stumbling and running. I don't make it more than another mile until I misstep and trip over a branch, tripping and smacking headfirst into a tree. I crumple over, taste blood. I had bit through my lip in the fall. I am dazed, but my adrenaline is still pumping, so I scramble to a T as my aunt turns and notices that I'm not right behind her. She scrambles back and drops to her knees in front of me, whispering. I'm dazed, but she keeps repeating that we need to keep going. I'm shaking so bad, I don't think I could walk, much less run. I have probably another mile and a half until I'm on my family's property, but another 2 until we're at an occupied cabin, my grandmother's. My ears are ringing, and I'm hardly paying attention to my aunt's frantic pleas. I completely psych myself out again and keep looking behind me, but I don't see anything. She decides that she's not going to waste any more time because of stupid me, and half drags me up and forward. I hobble forward as quick as I can as she continues to pull me too quickly. The rest is a blur until we break through the trees. Most of my family wasn't there at the time, so we only stop when we make it to my grandmother's, and I just run in, sobbing. No one locks the doors around there, and my grandmother takes one horrified look at me and my aunt, who is equally cut up and scared looking, and yells for my grandfather, who promptly takes over and grabs his rifle. I can't put into sentences what just happened, so my aunt takes over, leaving out the part about her being as high as a kite. He and my grandmother go to cabin, gathering the men and their guns, as well as warning the women and children about what just occurred. There's no signal up there, so calling the sheriff wasn't an option, and to get up to the mountain, if they left immediately, would take over an hour. It's getting dark. The roads leading up to the property are so windy and steep, you'd have to be out of your mind to try and drive up them in the dark. My mother eventually got word and came over. She took one look at my aunt and said that I had probably just gotten high with her, which in turn made us overly paranoid, and when we saw the random fisherman who was trespassing, we jumped to conclusions and had probably startled him as much as he had startled us. She continued by saying that I probably just imagined he was taking my picture, or that he began chasing us, though my aunt had been the one to repeatedly retell the story. My aunt stood up and yelled at my mother, saying that I was a good kid and didn't do anything, and that we were telling the truth. They began screaming at each other, and my grandmother made them both stop, telling them both to grow up. Even with the men of my family scouring the woods, they never saw any sign of the man we had encountered earlier. Everyone on the mountain locked their doors that night, though, for the first time in a long time. And to this day, all I can wonder is if I'm part of some creepy picture collection. But considering what could have happened, maybe if I had been alone like normal, I can live with that. Because my parents had separated before I was born, I spent my time growing up between each of their houses. Each summer, until I turned 19, I stayed with my father in rural Missouri. He had grown up in the area himself, and most of his family still lived there. Without much to do, like going to the movies and stuff, I would fill my days hanging out with my older cousin and getting into mischief. Many of our long summer days were taken in wandering the surrounding woods. On one of these journeys, we came across a big lake sitting quietly by itself, out in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods. The water was crystal clear and filled with tons of monstrous fish. We asked the adults if they were aware of its existence, but none have heard of it. That was probably the reason for it having so many large fish. No one living in the area had fished it, and anyone who had in the past allowed its location to be lost. We would fish the pond 3 or 4 times, coming away with a stringer full of lunkers on each occasion. On the 5th occasion, we hoped to accumulate enough for a big family fish fry. The summer holiday was starting to wind down, and we figured a fish fry would be a great way to cap it off. It was a warm Saturday morning when we headed out. We started about an hour before sunup, because the walk-in took well over an hour. Besides, the fish stopped biting by the hottest part of the day, and we hoped to get back to my dad's house by early afternoon. The beautiful sight of the pond came into view around dawn. It didn't take long for us to get our first bites, and for the next 3 hours, the fish came quickly, one after another. Our limit was caught by 10:45, and I was rearing to get going. We had a 90-minute walk back with 2 5-gallon buckets packed to the top with fish. So, I imagined another 30 could be added to that. To my displeasure, my cousin thought it would be refreshing to take a dip in the lake before we left. He tried to pressure me into joining him, but I didn't know how to swim at the time. I just wanted to get back, but he was older than me, so he was in charge. I plopped my tail onto a rock and waited while he did his thing. There was an old rope tied to a tree, probably from 100 years ago, and he wanted to swing from it. It looked unsafe to me. However, my concerns were laughed off as he stripped down to his boxers, setting his clothes on the ground next to me. He climbed the tree a little ways and grabbed the rope. Pushing off, he swung out just a short distance before the rope snapped right above him. He'd made it out far enough to hit the deep water, but probably not as far as he intended. When he hit the water, his body made a dull thud sound. It certainly didn't sound normal, and likely hurt. I was planning on laughing at him, saying I told you so, but as the seconds passed, he never surfaced. The situation was quickly becoming scary. I looked around to see if he came up somewhere further away, perhaps floating unconscious because of the hard contact with the water, but still nothing. I was beginning to panic, and waded out as far as I dare, looking into the water for him. Unfortunately, the water became cloudy with every step I took, and made it impossible to see. Soon, it was clear to me that he had drowned. How? I had no idea. Perhaps if I could have swam back then, I may have been able to help him, but it was too late now. I was helpless to do anything more than pack up and head home. On the entire walk back, a small nugget of hope lingered in the back of my mind that he had tricked me and would pop up at some point. This didn't happen, however, and the dread I carried of telling my family grew with each step. I tried several times to find the words, but with each attempt, I would break down and choke on my tears. Ultimately, I could only manage, "Mark drowned." They got the point after that, and once I was able to pull myself together, I led my dad and uncle back out to the pond. Mark's body was still nowhere to be found. With no other options, we went into the sheriff's office to report the drowning. When I realized where we were headed, I started freaking out. In my young mind, I thought I was going to get in trouble or be blamed for my cousin's death. It took a few minutes, but they were able to convince me that I wasn't in trouble. Even after they had, I couldn't help but feel guilty every time I looked at my uncle, regardless of what he claimed. I couldn't believe he didn't blame me, even if it was just a small amount. I explained what happened to the sheriff, and the search began the next morning. Just by chance, that was the day I was going back to my mother's. That Monday night, my mom sat me down to tell me that a team of divers had found Mark's body earlier that day. When they discovered him, one of his feet were hung up on a sunken log, so they assumed that was why he never surfaced. I wish I could say this made me feel better, but it did not. It did, however, serve as a catalyst to learn how to swim. The guilt of not being able to help my cousin stayed with me for most of my life, and I never wanted to be in the position of not being able to help another person ever again. So in a twisted kind of way, his death had a positive impact on my life. However, if I had the choice, I'd prefer he still be with us. Listen, I'm sure you've gotten an abundant amount of stories from people who claim they have seen things in national forests, their own backyards, or what have you. Well, I'm here to tell you that I bet that I have something you've probably never heard of nor seen. When I was a child, The major back portion of the land we had was thick brush, steep inclines, and ravines with a lot of rocky terrain in between. It wasn't exactly your child's green forest where you can run around, make friends with all the animals, and build tree forts. It was a little more dangerous than that. On top of that, like the many of the people who submit stories to you, I've had my fair share of bizarre happenings out in those woods that have even followed me to our own house. It started when I was around 10 years old. On days that I did not have school, I would go around playing in the woods. I would always be trying to learn as much as I could about the woods around me, so I could be well versed in my own surroundings. This time, I can recall building some sort of tree fort with a bunch of fallen tree branches and sticks when my eye caught movement. The movement was far away, but it looked to be from a small animal. I was excited, so I swiftly and sneakily walked my way over to the patch of brush that this small animal happened to go into. As I approached the brush a little bit closer, it began to rustle and move. The next thing I know, out pops this little 2 to 3 foot tall goblin-like creature that I have never seen before. I'll never forget the mixture of emotions I felt in that moment. It was fear, mixed with awe, and total astonishment. This small creature immediately looked over at me, realized its cover had been entirely blown, and had the most panicked expression on its face. Quicker than I could say, "Gotcha," it turned around and disappeared. Now, I don't mean it vanished. I mean it was so lightning fast that it took off in the underbrush in the opposite direction and was gone. I sat there for a moment, sitting on the ground, just trying to process what I had just seen, trying to digest the fact that I had just witnessed something that was entirely real. I don't tell a lot of people this story because the few I've told it to have either laughed at me or told me it was just my childlike imagination. All I can tell you is that it was very typical goblin-like. It was a dark blue-green color, had bumpy-like scales over its skin, typical long goblin-like ears, a very elongated pointed chin and nose. I was looking at a real-life fantasy creature. It even had yellow eyes, but it didn't look evil, just ugly. I kind of freaked out and ran back home, but I did not say a word to either of my parents. What was the point? I knew they wouldn't believe a word I would tell them. A few nights go by, and I remember waking up to the light tapping sounds around our house. The tapping sounded very low to the ground, but loud enough that it woke me up. The thought of a raccoon came to my mind, and I kind of chuckled a bit, thinking we were trying to be invaded by raccoons. But then, the tapping grew louder and louder. I noticed it was happening all throughout and around the house outside. I jumped up out of my bed, out of curiosity, and looked out my window, down to the ground. I couldn't see anything because it was far too dark. But in my 10-year-old mind, I must have pictured a squad of 20 raccoons trying to case our house. Fearless me runs to the front door, turns on the porch light, and runs outside quickly, where I see a bunch of small black figures scatter like cockroaches. Now, that scared the hell out of me. I screamed, slammed the door shut, and ran back to my bedroom, waking up my parents in the process. My dad storms out of my parents' room, swearing and hollering, wondering and yelling, what was all that racket? He burst into my bedroom, demanding to know what's going on right this instant. I asked him if he heard the tapping outside, to which he replied he didn't know and didn't hear anything, and said that I was probably making it up. I swear, what is it with parents and being so far up their own buttholes to deny anything and everything beyond their comfortable bubble of reality? It seems to be a constant curse so many of us struggle with. After that had happened, I remember that I continued with life as normal, not really thinking much of it at all, until about a week or so after that. I was playing in the woods by myself, and it was starting to get dusky outside. I began to hear small footsteps pattering towards me, and it sounded like there were multiple sets of them, not just one. That's when I looked over my shoulder and saw several small dark shapes moving around in the brush. I couldn't see what they looked like, but I knew they were there. I heard them. I felt their presence. It was not an evil presence, just the presence of like when somebody's around you. I'm sure you and most of your readers and audience know what that feels like. The only thing I could really discern were small dark figures darting throughout the brush, trying to remain hidden from my eyesight. They made no noise, no breathing or talking or any of that. No laughter, growling or chattering. Sometimes I would hear leaves crunching or twigs snapping from being stepped on. I knew there were multiples of them, but I didn't know how many or where exactly they were at. I just knew they were beyond my eyesight, and they were intently watching me. Perhaps they were studying me as I studied them, even though I couldn't physically see them. At that point, I realized that me stumbling upon that gremlin, goblin person, whatever you want to call it, I think it somehow made them alert to me, because the feeling I got from that situation was that they were very curious and wanted to observe me the same way I observed it. It was them, too, that followed me back to my house and tapped on the house sighting that night, days prior to this happening. I didn't realize that at the time. At that moment, I too felt very cautious and kind of wished they would just reveal themselves as that one did, even if it was accidentally. In fact, I think that first time it was accidental, because I guess it did not know that I was there. I slowly got up and moved out of the area. Ultimately, I had no idea what I was dealing with or if they had bad intentions, although I didn't feel anything evil or bad, only curiosity. 10-year-old me wanted to be safe, and I wasn't about to take chances. I didn't know anything about them or what was following me, or if they were following me, so I just left the area. We actually ended up moving very shortly after this last incident, so I really don't know what became of anything after the fact. After this third and final incident, there was never any more sightings for me of these things. We ended up moving, I want to say 4 months later in late fall, so no more encounters with these creatures. I'm sure they were still very much a part of the forest, but maybe more reserved. I always wonder and think back if they ever reveal themselves to other people who have wandered through the area. I don't know who owns that house now, because this was a long while ago. Years and years back. I guess it would have been a great place for them to stay undiscovered. Nobody ever went back there except for me. It was virtually uncharted territory, with the occasional mountain lion and deer that came through the area, but that's about it. I want to say I remember my father at one point or another talking about potential land development, but I don't think that ever came to full fruition. I would love to be able to go back there now and see if they are still living there, which I'm sure they still are. I wonder if they would reveal themselves to me. Part of it definitely creeps me out, just because it's still the unknown. Now, before I end my email to you, I wanted to give you a vague point of reference. I played the video game World of Warcraft on and off the past 15 years. There is a creature in that game you encounter in the Horde starting area. I believe they're called Goblins, but I can't remember off the top of my head. You end up killing them for a quest you do when you're a very low-leveled character. They look very similar to what I saw. Obviously, the game is much more cartoonish looking than what I saw, but it's a semi-accurate depiction and gets the gist across of what I saw. The character in the game had the same long chin, nose, and long ears that I saw on this thing. I'll send you a pic so you could see what I'm referring to. I also didn't notice any jewelry, like rings on the ears, nose, or any clothing, like most modern fantasy creatures have. So that's my story. I know you get a lot of crazy stuff sent to you, but this genuinely happened, and I don't have anything else to add, nor do I have any incentive to make this up. I am still an avid outdoors fan, and like to do stuff that most people enjoy, like hiking and camping. I have not experienced anything like Bigfoot or Dogman, or anything like that. I have been listening to your channel for a while now, and wanted to send you my childhood experience. Anyway, you've kind of given me the courage to share it, and hope you choose to share this with your audience in hopes that it helps others like myself gather the courage to share their story. I kind of always thought I was possibly crazy, but it's great to hear that there are others like me that have had so many bizarre experiences and sightings that they too were too scared to share with the world. Thank you for being a light to us all. Okay, so I was about 14 at the time, and I grew up pretty poor. My mother at this time really was slowly disappearing from my life, to where I was later on homeless. But at this time, she was still around me, and we were sleeping on the kitchen floor, as it was the comfiest floor in the house. I regularly get night terrors and sleep paralysis, but this time it felt different. I woke up immediately feeling like I was being watched. I found it hard to breathe. I was just so terrified. Everything in my mind told me not to open my eyes, but being as curious as I am, I opened them anyways. What I saw, I'll never forget. I saw this creature. It looked to be about 7 feet tall, but somehow fit into our small apartment hallway. Its bones were all deformed and broken, but it didn't look like it was in any pain. At this point, I had sat up and started to move backwards, away from this thing. It was all white and had hair everywhere. There was something draining from its mouth, and when it would move nearer to me, I could hear this thing's bone cracking. I closed my eyes, hoping it would go away, but I could still hear it. I started actually screaming, and my mother woke up and yelled at me for screaming. But I told her what had happened, and when I opened my eyes, it was gone. My mother continues to insist I'm lying, but I swear what I saw that night was real, and it was not human. This story takes place in the deserts of Arizona. Me and my dad are on a camping trip with the rest of our family, but thanks to the size of the family, we had to take 2 cars. 1 car for the boys and 1 for the girls. I had 3 sisters, but I was the only boy. 3 hours later, and nightfall approaches, making it harder to drive with only 1 headlight working. So my dad decides we should stop and camp there for the night. I said I was down, as long as we could sleep in the car. Not really camping, but if you had to choose between a car seat and the ground, then we'll talk. Anyway, he agreed. So we drove off the road and onto the sand with cactus as far as the eye can see. We both began our descent into slumber. Only I couldn't, as I was a bit of an insomniac, which I was fine with. It just meant I could look up at the night sky. But then I heard a blood-curdling screech of some kind of humanoid howling at the vast emptiness of the desert. At first, I thought it was a coyote, but coyotes don't sound like that. Frozen solid, I look out the window to see a tall, lanky creature standing on all fours of its extremely long, unnatural appendices. At first glance, it would have just blended in with the cacti surrounding the area, with its seemingly prickly skin. But I didn't just peek and look away. I was flat out staring at it, until my eyes locked with its 2 small white dots, was all I could see. I'm pooping bricks at this point, but bricks turn to boulders as it full out charges at the small car, which could easily be flipped with very little effort. I guess all that commotion woke up my dad, because before I knew it, we're driving off of the sand back onto the road, flooring it the whole way, only to get the back window smashed in with the creature slamming its 2-fingered hand in the glass screen, sending shards everywhere, even into its own hand. It didn't follow us for much longer, as it had glass shrapnel in its hand. It started to slow down and limp away, leaving blood marks on the back door. We kept driving without looking back, fearing to see it again. Eventually, we had to stop as we caught up with the rest of the family, and we all shared the same expressions on our face and the look of terror glued on. That day is one I'll never forget. My best friend, I'll call her T, and I, L, used to explore the woods around her elementary school when we were just teenagers. There were sidewalk trails around the grounds and play areas, so people were often around. Children playing, dogs being walked, joggers and bikers, like a mini park at times. The day I'm telling you about was different. It was quiet. No one was out. It was cloudy, damp and dark, even with it being early afternoon. But we wanted to go out anyway. We were restless kids. Adventure was totally our middle names. With our backpacks of water bottles and sketchbooks in tow, we cut through the school ground, crossed the creek into the woods. We climbed a slate wall to get into a small hill, dense with trees and undergrowth. The creek was low, so we were able to see the banks through it. Since it was summer, you couldn't walk along them, unless you wanted to guarantee an hour picking ticks off your leg. So, we continue upwards. The top of the hill was maybe 12 feet wide once it leveled out. A steep drop down the creek that looped around the hill on all three sides. We snaked around the trees until we came to the edge, which was mostly a clearing. I walked back along the edge, T warning me to be careful because the dirt was loose and she didn't want me to fall. Taking her warning, I held onto some trees and continued to look over the edge when I stopped cold in my tracks. 10 feet below me, floating in the relatively calm creek water, was a creature. Bigger than a house cat, smaller than a dog, small head, huge paws, and pointy ears, with a relatively long tail, completely skinned with no eyes. I had to take a second look. What? I turned around to find T a few yards away, looking out into where our creek meets a larger creek. Hey, T? I had to repeat twice because my voice caught in my throat. Come here. T trotted over warily, probably seeing the confusion in my face. Without saying a word, I pointed down into the water, the creature still floating lifeless. What? She whispered. What is that? I shrugged. To hell if I knew. It was huge but looked too much like a cat. Surely this was just some cruel animal abuse case, right? Elle, over here. T's voice was dark and scared. She had walked a few feet ahead of me, following the edge of the hill. Down in the creek were 3 more of these things, varying ever so slightly in size, but all skinned and not proportioned at all like the cats we both were beginning to lose hope that they were. As we walked along the edge, looking for more, we began to notice the mood in the woods had changed. It was quieter. The wind stopped blowing. No birds were chirping or flying around. The water had even become quieter as it flowed over the rocks. We counted 7, total. 7 creatures skinned and dead, 1 without eyes, a few missing paws and tails. The weirdest part being none of them with any ounce of decay on them. I want a closer look. I have to know what these are, I said. T giving me a look and said that she was thinking about it. I didn't hear you say that. But she was also curious. As we made our way back down, we increasingly began to feel like we were being watched, but we pressed on. We made our way through the creek in the direction of the corpses. I'm sure they were right here, I whispered to myself. Elle! T shouted behind me and grabbed my arm, stopping my next step, which would have been on one of the corpses. 8. A chill went up my spine. I had never felt an emotion as sickening as this in my life. They weren't hairless. They were definitely skinned. No decay. Some missing pieces. We eventually got too freaked out and ran, running faster back towards the school because it felt like we were being glared at and followed. We ran all the way home. We went back the next day, and they were all gone. They didn't wash away because there was no reason for the waters to rise so much to take them. To this day, 5 years later, we still get creeped out when we think about it, and we have never found any answers as to what creature did this. For some background info, I am an 18-year-old male. I live with my dad and 2 siblings and my 2 dogs. Poppy, a black Labrador, cross Staffy, and Missy. Right now, I am on summer break from college, and my mental health hasn't been very good at all. Every night, I have nightmares and wake up several times a night. But this time was different. I had a dream that I was trying to sleep in my bed, but something woke me up. My bedroom door creaked open. Something big and demonic slouched down and entered my room. This creature was tall, with black fur and a white face. It looked like a mixed dog with human. Surprisingly, all I did in my dream was turn away and pull the blanket over my ear, but I could still see the creature as if it had eyes in the back of my head. The creature turned and left my bedroom. I assume it lost interest because it thought I had. As soon as the creature left my bedroom, I woke up. I was spooked and thankful that it was a dream, but then I looked at my door and saw that it was open. I always make sure to keep my door closed, and my door is extremely stiff. You have to kick it to open it. This happened about an hour ago. It is now 6 a.m. I don't really know what this was, but I will update this if anything else happens. I would appreciate any explanation or theories anybody could offer. Hi everyone. I do not want my name out on the internet because it never goes away once it's out there. Putting yourself out there with these kinds of stories puts a huge target on your back, or so I believe it does. I'm going to keep my identity a secret, as to not be the laughing stock of my family. Anyway, a few years ago, I decided to reach out to several different cryptozoologist investigators about strange sightings as I was having what I believe to be reptilians. I call them that because they are these 9-foot tall, half-human, half-lizard-like creatures, their face resembling that of a dinosaur. I have always suspected we had more than one cryptid in this state. Normally, it's all Bigfoot, 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 but I have yet to see a Bigfoot. Instead, I get to deal with these things. I live close to a large river, and have about 30 acres of land that my parents bought long ago. The lizardmen, as I call them, have been sighted off the nearby roads, which also borders along a nearby river. I am originally from Colorado Springs and live near the Fall River. I won't tell you exactly where or how close, but close enough. I decided to put out cams to see if I could catch any or get any pictures of these. I did catch glimpses of them on camera, but nothing more discernible than blurry shapes. Strange, because deer and other wildlife show up just fine on picture. But these things, I can't explain it. I wish I could. They appear as large blurry shapes. It has to be them. Nothing else shows up as an 8 to 9 foot tall dark blur on camera. I've even gone out to the spots the pictures were taken and where these shapes were in the pictures. The branches are pretty high off the ground, several feet above my head. I don't have an explanation for that kind of activity. I've been having strange encounters with these things ever since I was a teenager, back in the 1980s. The first time being when one of these creatures stuck its face against my window while I slept, and I woke up to this hideous serpentine face staring at me. I was so terrified. During this event, as a teenager, for a short while, maybe a few years, we actually lived very close to town. We were not in the thick neck of the woods by any means. For this to happen in such a populated area gave me the chills. At the time, my bedroom window was far off the ground because there was a slope that headed down outside my window, outside my house. That means whatever looked into my window that night had to have been easily over 8 foot tall, and this thing's head filled up my window. I must have thought it was some sort of dinosaur or something, because it wasn't until later in life that I actually saw these beings in person for what they are, that I put them together, and then I was able to put it together, and I had the epiphany. The other feeling of knowing you're not safe, and that these things can get you any time. They want to put you on edge and keep you there. When it was watching me sleep, and when I woke up, it looked at me. It just had this sinister expression. It was like it wanted me to know it can get me any time that it wanted to. But it didn't. It just wanted to terrify me. I never told my parents about it. My father has had his own run-ins with Bigfoot while out hunting. They become something he's just learned to deal with over time. He's told me about a few encounters here or there, but never really gone in depth about any of them. Growing up, he would warn me about them in the woods, but I never took them seriously because I never had any sightings of them personally. I have one pic that I got of these reptilian lizardmen where you can kind of make out their shapes, but still too blurry for any real detail. In the picture, there were 4 of them standing around this shape on the ground. The shape I believed to be a deer, but it was hard to tell in the lighting. Again, it was very strange. The deer in the picture was in perfect focus, not blurry at all, and yet here are these 4 large humanoid shapes standing around it, totally blurry. I'll give you some size estimation of just how big these figures are. They take up a span of about 4 to 5 feet wide, hulking huge shoulders and elongated heads. Very dark since they are blurred, but you can still make out the shape. I don't see any tails or any real color to them. I felt pure fear when I was looking at that picture. I felt like I might be dealing with something much more supernatural, as cheesy as that sounds. Could they possibly be hunting and about to kill the deer? The deer in the picture is down on the ground and looks like it was either freshly killed or about to be. Either way, when I saw the things face my window that first time as a teen, that was enough for me. It was quite ugly, to say the least. I've seen them before out in the wilderness, but they don't like to be exposed. They are very concealed creatures. They almost kind of remind me of beings that can blend in with their surroundings, masters of camouflage. I haven't seen this for myself, but I was told by a couple of my nearby neighbors that there are these huge dirt mounds, or dirt-like mounds a couple of miles back, beyond the river, into the national forest. They claim there are some significant ties to those mounds and these reptilian creatures. I have no idea if it's true, because I've never seen them, and I've been out hunting and exploring this area for a while. These neighbors of mine also keep their animals indoors and have had several personal sightings of their own of these lizard men. They are incredibly hostile and will act aggressively when given the opportunity. The lizard men, not my neighbors. Sorry, I thought I should clarify that. Living out here where I am, you do learn to keep your pets indoors and out of the hairs of critters like the ones around here. I do have a couple of rotties, and I keep them most of the time with me. I see how these things hunt and kill their prey, and I have zero desire to have any of my pets or dogs fall victim to these things. The only real time I take my dogs out with me is when I go into town or go on walks with them. Both my rotties are very sweet, gentle dogs, not aggressive in nature. They will guard me with their life though. They put themselves in the way between me and a mother bear before with cubs, so I know they are dedicated enough. A few months ago, as spring was coming up, we saw this buck that was passing through who had part of his face missing, large scars and cuts all over his body, and a severely disfigured leg. The thing looked pretty pulverized, but I know that deer can take beatings out here in the wild. There are times at night where I've let my dogs out to use the bathroom, and they start barking ferociously in the night. Then, the barking turns into a whimper and whining, and then turns to running, and they get back into my house as fast as they can. Something big is out there, spooking my dogs at night. That's why I don't like to let them out of my sight. There's been a couple of times at night that I'll be lying in bed and hear loud crashing sounds at the river. Whatever is making the sounds has to be humongous, because to make that sort of amplified noise, well, it couldn't come from anything small. I'll just say that. I've never seen anything at my windows though, not since my teenage experiences. I'll hear weird hissing and clicking noises at random times when out in the woods. All sorts of things I can't exactly pinpoint to one thing. I don't want to forget to mention that when we go to walks, my dogs won't go anywhere near the river. They are freaked out by it. My one Rottie just starts sniffing and immediately shuts down and puts her head to the ground. That's very unlike my dog to do that. The few crypto investigators I've invited out to my place have been far too freaked out by what I told them to do any real thorough investigations. I've only had a few, but they told me dealing with reptilian-like beings is a no-no. Is that even a thing? Is there some conspiracy that I don't know about with cryptozoologists that they can't investigate reptilians? I didn't ask to be dealing with these creatures. The very first investigator I had come out went out on a night down by the river and was gone the very next morning. Called me later that same day and told me he would not investigate further, that he was attacked by a large reptilian lizard-like creature that nearly took his life. I fear that these creatures will soon try and put a target on me and my dogs if we make the wrong move. I showed the other investigators some of the pictures that I've taken of wildlife around here, mainly deer, and how when they're taken a picture of, they're in total focus. Then, show them the ones with these large reptilian lizard men and how they're always blurred out no matter what. That's why I said it's very supernatural-like, and it freaks me right out. Kind of reminds me of how there's always an electromagnetic pulse or static in the air that seems to fry electronics whenever there's aliens around. I'm not saying they're alien, I'm just saying it's supernatural in a sense like that. I'm sorry if I'm all over the place, but there's so much for me to type out to you. Let me know if you want me to give you even more stories and details, because I got a bunch living out here. Thanks, and stay safe. If you're going out to the woods, never go by yourself, and always bring a large, high-caliber weapon with you. Don't be fooled. You are not safe by yourself. No matter what the Forest Service or any experienced quote-unquote woodman will tell you. Don't be a statistic of a missing person. Good day. My name is Samantha, but I go by Sam. I'm a 26-year-old female from Eastern Canada, and this story takes place in December, right before Christmas and right after my birthday. We were in full swing winter mode. We had just gotten a stunning dumping of snow just a couple of days prior, maybe 2 days before this incident. I'd say we got about 30 centimeters of snow. Anyone who lives in Eastern Canada will know that we get dumped with snow and frigid temperatures throughout most of wintertime. I decided to have a birthday bash. I don't normally celebrate my birthday, but I decided that it would be a good time since marijuana was finally legalized. I picked up a ton of food, booze, and marijuana. My boyfriend, we will call him Jim, and I live together. I'm in school full-time and only work part-time while he works full-time in sales. Because it was so close to Christmas, Jim was working a ton of extra hours, meaning that I was left home to clean the entire house and shovel the driveway by myself before guests arrive. Keep in mind that we got 30 centimeters of snow I had to shovel through. My driveway was at least 100 feet long, and the plow pushed snow to the end of my driveway, making a lot of hard ice that I had to chop through. By the time I finished cleaning and shoveling, I was exhausted. I wasn't going to let that ruin my night, so I showered, get dressed, and waited for friends to arrive. As I was waiting, I decided to have a couple of drinks. I don't drink very often. In fact, I'm rarely even a social drinker. But tonight, I decided to really go for it. I wanted to get drunk, so I started pounding drinks back, one gin and tonic after the other. I was visibly drunk by the time friends arrived, and Jim asked me to slow down a bit. But hey, it was my birthday. I was already drinking and I did not want to stop. I spent the next couple of hours jumping around from groups of people at the house, socializing. My roommate gave me a joint, so I went out and smoked it by myself. I also don't smoke often at all, so I was really going all out that night. My best friend, Karen, showed up with her husband around the same time. She's recently married and had just bought a house, so they were busy getting it ready to move in. She wasn't drinking, but from what she told me afterwards, I was very intoxicated and mean. I don't usually get mean when I drink. I'm more often than not funny, not mean. I remember leaving her to go outside with two friends who had medical-grade marijuana in a bong, and they offered me a hit. This is where the night turned for me. I took a hit of the bong and immediately went lightheaded. I stood outside for another minute or so, trying to follow along in my friend's conversation, but I just couldn't focus on anything. I stumbled inside and went into my room. A little background on the house. It was a small bungalow with 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, kitchen, living room, and a laundry room. The kitchen was the main part of the house, with all the rooms coming off the kitchen. To the left was the living room. To the right was 2 bedrooms. Then directly across the living room was the bathroom, and then next to that was my bedroom, the master. I went into my room to lay down and hopefully shake this lightheaded feeling. However, as soon as I put my head on the pillow, I stopped breathing. I couldn't see straight, but I was able to open my phone and text Jim. All I could manage to say was, "Help me." Then I realized that he was not going to be checking his phone anytime soon, as he was with his friends doing shots in the living room. So I called him. He picked up on the second ring, and I said, "Jim, I can't breathe. I think I'm dying. Can you please come help me?" Jim took me back outside to get some air. After this, I don't remember a whole lot. I remember clinging onto him for dear life, pleading with him to save me and to call an ambulance. The next thing I remember is falling backwards with this intense tunnel vision. I could see the eave of the house, then the stars, and then nothing. Jim later told me that I fainted, and I had a horrified look on my face and let out a long, deep moan as I fell. Jim caught me as I was falling, and thankfully, I didn't hit my head too hard, just my bottom, which gave me a nasty bruise afterwards. This part of the story I don't remember at all. This is all based on what I've been told from Jim, Karen, and her husband Ben. When I lost consciousness, Jim ran inside to ask for help. Karen and Ben rushed out and Ben checked my pulse, but I didn't have one. Jim and Ben immediately began to perform CPR with chest compressions, while Karen called 911. The police arrived first and took over performing CPR until the ambulance arrived. Once the ambulance arrived and the paramedics took over, I began to regain consciousness for just a minute. I could feel Karen removing my earrings and the paramedics calling my name and pushing on my fingertips, but I couldn't respond. At this point, I thought I had been in a car accident. I had left the house earlier the night to meet my friend that couldn't find the house. I was very drunk at this point and was foolishly walking in the middle of the road, so I thought I had been hit by a car. After she removed my earrings, I lost consciousness again. They hooked up the AED, but put a tube down my throat, which hit my gag reflex and made me vomit. This jump-started my heart. I can remember them saying, "Atta girl, Samantha, breathe," and rolling on my side. They loaded me onto a stretcher and rushed me to the hospital. I was unconscious for another 6 hours, and it was during this time that I thought I was in hell. What I'm about to tell you may not sound incredibly scary, but if you've ever experienced something like this, you will understand. While I was unconscious, I could hear voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying at first. I could also form thoughts, but couldn't force myself to wake up. I was surrounded by black and white zigzags, and it felt like I was falling endlessly. I really genuinely thought I had died and gone to hell. The total seclusion was terrifying. The thought of being in that place for the rest of eternity, with nothing but my conscious mind, scared me beyond belief. At times during my time at the hospital, I could feel the doctors picking at me, applying pressure to my fingernails and tapping my reflexes. I thought it was small torture from Satan. I fluttered my eyes open at one point and can see the doctors, but they were not real. They were cartoon. After a while, the voices in my head became more clear. The voices said horrible things such as, "You're in hell because God hates fags. I'm bisexual. You will not be forgiven for your sins. You are doomed to an eternal hell. And when you wake up, you won't really be alive. This is a part of your torture to make you believe you're okay. And then we're going to pull you back in when you least expect it." The zigzags continued for it seemed like aeons. Then I heard the doctors plain as day. They said, "I don't think she's going to wake up anytime soon." And as soon as they said that, the voices told me to wake up, and my eyes snapped open. When I opened my eyes, they had me strapped to a table, preparing me for a CT scan. They asked me if I knew where I was and the date. I told them my name, and said it's December 15th. Am I dead? The doctor laughed and said, actually, it's the 16th now. And no, you're not dead. Your friends are waiting for you. We'll bring you out after your scan. I told the doctor that I know I'm dead, and that once I come into the inner scan, I will be back in the hell with zigzags. She looked at me puzzled, and then started the scan. I woke up again, about a half hour later in my room with Jim, Ben, and Karen, where they told me all about the events of the night. This accident really messed up my brain. I didn't sleep well for months, had to get into intense therapy. I was diagnosed with depression, anxiety, PTSD, as well as OCD, and I'm now heavily medicated. The medication helps me from feeling like I'm dead, but I still have moments where I wonder if I actually did die that night. Nothing ever did show up on my CT scan, and the only things in my system were marijuana and alcohol, no other drugs. Jim thinks that it was a mixture of exhaustion from all the shoveling I did that day, mixed with a panic attack, causing it to be a lot more serious. I was not a very religious person before this. I did believe in a higher power, a God, but I didn't follow Christianity. After this, I try to become more connected to God. I'm trying to be a better person, and I ask for forgiveness for my sins. If I did experience hell that night, I never, ever want to go back. And if I'm dead, and this is all just an illusion, then good one, Satan. Good one. I have read countless stories about other people's experiences with sleep paralysis, and thought I would share my scariest ones. Everyone has heard of the shadow people. I've had an unknown black force pin me down in bed, suffocating me. However, the other two instances I've had are more bizarre, and I still think about it quite often. About 4 years ago, I was 24 years old. I still lived with my mom since I was in my second year of nursing school, and it was just easier to live at home while going to school. For context, I'm a female. Going to bed one night, all seemed well until I woke up for no reason. I couldn't move or talk. I heard almost static mumbling sounds on my left. Scared, I listen as I try to desperately move. Slowly, the static starts to get clearer and more clear, and I hear young voices, children voices. They begin chanting, "You're going to die," and giggling each time they chant. It was like they were singing a nursery rhyme. They chanted the same thing over and over again. My heart was pounding out of my chest. Logically in my head, I was telling myself this wasn't real. For those aren't religious, this may not seem like it makes sense, but I decided to pray to God in my head to make it stop. It was like I was screaming at it in my head because I couldn't physically speak. It felt like an eternity before it went away, and I was able to move. I was so scared that I couldn't move, even though I was physically able to. I rushed out of my room to my mom and told her everything. I didn't go back into my room that night. She looked at me with disbelief. I don't know if she truly believed me or understands sleep paralysis. Regardless, it's something I will never forget. My second story was around the same year. When sleep paralysis becomes a reoccurring theme every night, or every other night, I just started to sleep with the lights on. For added comfort, my cats would sleep on my bed and cuddle with me until I fell asleep. For a while, no instances of sleep paralysis had occurred, so I just assumed this was what I needed to do each night. Like usual, I went to bed with the lights on, and one of my cats, Salem, curled up on my arm while I slept. I woke up with a feeling that's all too familiar. I couldn't believe what was happening. I felt like I was being watched. To my horror, I can't make this up if I wanted to, disturbingly saw a white figure on the right side of my bed, standing very close to me. My heart felt like it dropped into my stomach. I see piercing, bright blue eyes staring back at me, and as I stared more, this white figure looked like it was a member of the KKK, with a white cloak, and the only thing I was able to see was its eyes. As I was staring at this figure in my lighted up room, I was able to glance down at my cat, seemingly unaware of the figure and sleeping soundly. This eased me up a bit. Seeing this made me remind myself that this wasn't real. After a few moments, the figure disappeared. Even with the lights on, I wasn't safe. I don't experience sleep paralysis as much as I used to, thankfully, but those are some instances where I'll never forget. This happened back to me and my cousin, who I'll call Blake for this story, back in the fall of 2009. Our grandmother decided to let us stay the night over at her house, as she often did, because me and my cousin were really close, and she was the only relative that let us stay the night at her house. Now, her house was always creepy to us, and we always said that to our papa, who passed away about 6 years before this, was still in the house watching over us. Looking back, it really didn't make sense, but it helped us sleep at night. Anyway, that night, after rounds of junk food and Call of Duty, we decided that it was time for bed. Now, one thing we always did at my grandmother's house was sleep with the TV on. That will be relevant in a minute. As we lay in our beds, we heard a loud thud come from downstairs. My eyes shot open and looked towards the door. Now, the TV wasn't super quiet, but it wasn't super loud either. Not to mention, we were on the second floor of the house, so the fact that I had heard a big thud was worrying to me. I turned over and shook Blake to see if he was still awake. Turns out he had been awake for longer than me because he couldn't sleep, so he had heard the thud too. "What was that?" I asked. "I have no idea. You think we should check it out?" he had asked me. "Yeah, we need to make sure Mama is okay," I said. That was the one mistake that possibly led to what happened afterwards. We both got up and slowly approached the door. I turned the knob and opened the door. We stepped outside onto the landing. I started to turn and walk down the stairs when Blake stopped me. I turned and he seemed like he was listening for something. Then another loud thud came from downstairs. So, being the idiots we were, we didn't think about it being an intruder, so we thought it was a ghost. I was really into ghost hunters and shows like that at the time, so I pulled out my sister's old Razor flip phone and started to record us asking questions. "Is there someone here with us?" I asked. No response. "Papa, is that you?" Blake asked. Just then, a huge crash could be heard, like something made out of glass had hit the floor. We scrambled into the bedroom. Once we were both inside, I slammed the door shut. I breathed a sigh of relief until I heard what sounded like somebody going to the drawer on the nightstand. I turned and looked at Blake. He was paralyzed, staring towards his side of the bed. The nightstand drawer was open. Again, following what I had done before, I pulled up the thermal filter on the camera of my phone. What I saw turned my blood to ice. A shadowy humanoid figure was bent over and was digging through the drawer. My cousin had snapped out of his trance and looked over at the phone. He gasped. Then the thing jerked its head to look at us. It knew it was caught. It then stood up straight and then turned to face us. I was about ready to poop myself at this point, and I just knew this thing was going to kill us both, and nobody would know what had happened. But then something weird happened. It disappeared, almost like it was blinked out of existence. I wasted no time. I tore open the door and practically flew down the stairs. I ran into the spare bedroom, downstairs, and turned to see if Blake followed me. Thankfully, he wasn't too far behind. Once we were both inside, I slammed the door and locked it. "What was that thing?" Blake had asked me. "I don't know, but I'm not going to sleep. I don't want that thing to sneak up on us." And we didn't. We stayed up watching these old sitcoms that networks would play in the early morning until we saw sunlight peeking through the blinds in the room. We both then passed out. When we woke up, our grandmother had asked us what we were doing last night because all she heard was banging all night long. Both of our faces drained of color. We didn't want to tell her what we saw, so we just said we couldn't sleep and stayed up most of the night. I wish that was the end, but one more terrifying event would unfold. We got my phone to go back and check the recording we had. You could hear me ask my question, and we heard no response. But when Blake asked his question, he got an answer. About 5 seconds after he asked if our papa was there with us, he heard a harsh whisper say, "Yes." A few weeks later, my sister and our cousin Lee were sleeping upstairs in the dead of night, when all of a sudden, she was awoken by what sounded like a deck of cards being shuffled, but somehow she managed to fall back asleep. Not even an hour later, Lee was awoken by a blood-curdling scream coming from the corner of the room. She then woke my sister up, and they ran downstairs to sleep on the couch. She said it came from a woman, then reluctantly told her what me and Blake encountered a couple years before. She looked at me in shock. That was the last creepy thing to ever happen to us in that house, because as life went on, we started going to her house a lot less and less. It got to the point where all of us had forgotten about all these things that had happened. I brought it up a few years later, and it still sent shivers down my cousin's spine. A new family bought the house after my grandma passed away just a couple of years ago, so I only pray that whatever is in that house is gone now. I found out a few years later that what we saw was a shadow person. I don't know why it was at that house or what it was looking for, but it sends shivers down my spine to know that whatever was up there could have been watching us while we slept. I am no stranger to sleep paralysis. I have suffered it from childhood. I will be the first to admit that I did not understand it. I honestly believe during that time I was somewhere between life and death. Trying to explain it to my parents, who equally did not understand it, I was afraid to talk about it after the initial talk with my parents, as I did not want to appear crazy. It was not until I went to school to be an RN that I understood it. Yet, I will also admit, I never saw anything. Not demons, not shadow people, not even lucid dreaming. It just became a part of my life I accepted. Until now. I have many families scattered throughout the States as well as Ireland. I travel between the two. Last night, however, something changed. I flew from County Kerry, spent a couple of nights in New York City before traveling to a small town in Missouri to visit a beloved uncle. He is single and owns a huge house that sits on Lake Table Rock. When I say huge, I mean huge. Several bedrooms that each hold a bath as well as a separate bathroom. It should be turned into a bed and breakfast. He gave me the choice of rooms, and I chose one overlooking the lake as opposed to one overlooking the gardens, as it is currently wintertime. My uncle, who owns this little 4.5 kilogram dog that yaps at its own shadow. For reference, I'm not a pet person. I own a dog that I love, yet I tolerate other people's pets. So naturally, for the most part, ignore this tiny dog. I tucked into bed, wondering if I could acclimate to the time change. I promise I closed the door to my room. I woke up to this tiny dog on my chest, yapping. Come on, a tiny dog yaps, not barks, and looking at the door. I realized I was in sleep paralysis. My first thought was not what the dog may have been yapping at, just that he was. My second thought was, I closed my door. How did he get in? I was able to turn my head towards the door. Anyone who has suffered sleep paralysis knows what a feat is, yet I still could not turn my body. Then I saw it, him, whatever, the shadow man. He took up the entire door frame. Was my first or second reaction fear? No. I was still wondering why the door was open. I thought to myself, alright, I am obviously in sleep paralysis. Usually when this happens, I just tell myself there's nothing else to do but go back to sleep. Or I can try and figure this out. So I looked at him. He was nothing but shadow, yet I had the feeling I was looking in his eyes as he was looking in mine. All the time this dog was yapping. I got the feeling he wanted to cause terror and fear in me. Yet as we looked at each other, I was curious about him. I felt his malice change to one of curiosity himself. He did not understand why I was not afraid. He was just as curious about me as I was him. All at once, the hall light went on. he disappeared. I heard my uncle say to his dog, "Stop barking at." The dog left me at this point and went with my uncle. I was released from the paralysis and walked over to my door and locked it. You may wonder how I could do this so nonchalantly and wrap myself in my blankets and fall right back to sleep. I can only say it was my rational and analytical mind. Surely such things do not happen, right? The next morning, my uncle made a delicious breakfast. See why I said this house should be a bed and breakfast. I was not getting to talk about the night's events before, until my uncle said, "You saw the Shadow Man, did you not?" for the first time. I was at a loss for words. My name is Tom Kinski, and I am the vice chair of the Boston Grotto, a caving club affiliated with the National Speleological Society. We meet the first Wednesday of every month on MIT campus and regularly send out open invitations in the hopes of attracting new members. There are always people who show up interested. I'd like to think this wasn't just due to the pizza we order in from the upper crust on Charles Street. But who am I kidding? Everyone loves pizza. The Boston Grotto also organizes yearly caving trips to some fascinating, flung places. Last summer, we planned a deep cave expedition in the karstic limestone plateau of southern Turkey. We actually helped to map out the lower reaches of the cave system, extending the depth of the Morka cave from 919 meters to 1240 meters. It is now officially the third deepest cave in Turkey, all thanks to our hard work and dedication. It's a very, very fulfilling hobby, but caving is neither easy, nor is it really relaxing. In fact, on occasion, caving can be hazardous, terrifying, or even fatal. I have plenty of stories detailing brushes with the danger of death, but the one I'm about to tell you is one that sticks with me the most. So, a few years back, a ranger from the Glacier National Park in Montana got in touch with the NSS regarding a previously unexplored cave system. Christy Starr, the office manager of the NSS, then referred the ranger to us due to our expertise in mapping out unexplored sections of cave systems. The ranger then got in touch with the Boston Grotto, and then basically offered us an all-expense paid caving trip to the Glacier National Park. Needless to say, we were ecstatic. You see, whether we're talking about Francis Dark, Magellan, or even Lewis and Clark, we can conclude the most, if not all, of the Earth's surface has been thoroughly documented and mapped out. There is very little in the way of land left to explore, but the same cannot be said for what lies beneath our feet. The National Speleological Society alone estimates that only 10 to 15% of the world's cave systems have been documented and mapped out. I'm not sure people realize just what an opportunity that presents people like us. We have the chance to explore places that no man or woman has ever stepped foot in before, to truly be the next generation of explorers, carrying the torch in place of ancient sailors, 19th century African adventurers, or even the space-faring astronauts of the 60s and 70s. I mean, there's very real possibility of being able to name something the Kinski Caves, or something along those lines. The very real possibility that some of us could be immortalized in the way that Stanley or Abbott have been, giving their names to Port Stanley in Africa or in British India. And so it was that myself and 2 other members of the Boston Grotto ended up driving all the way out to Montana in a van filled with caving gear, snacks, and beer. Given that the drive took a couple of days, we made something of a road trip out of it, stopping off at Chicago to stretch our legs and take in the sights of the Windy City. Accompanying me on a trip was Paul Hutchinson, coordinator of experience-based training here at Boston University, and another member of the Grotto, Nestor Ramos, previously employed by Lynchburg College, Virginia. Hutch had expanded the outdoor leadership program to include backpacking, rock climbing, horizontal caving, vertical caving, and canoeing, as well as creating an academic minor in outdoor recreation. To others, caving and other outdoor activities were just a hobby. But for Hutch, it was more of a vocation, something he was compelled to do, something that was in his blood. And he brought that same passion to almost everything he did. Nestor, on the other hand, was a relatively new member of the grotto, but what he lacked in raw experience, he made up for in enthusiasm and competence. He was a natural in ways that made the very younger me very envious. After almost 5 whole days worth of driving, we finally made it to Browning, Montana. We stopped to get a bite to eat, and then headed further down Highway 2 until we reached where we'd be staying, the Traveler's Rest Lodge, a set of log cabins that were very bit as charming as rustic as I had imagined. We slept like the dead that night, and after sleeping in a van for 4 nights, I had never been so appreciative of the divine human invention that is the mattress. The next morning came, and the trip out to Glacier Park itself. We packed up our gear, which included our very specialized helmets, lights, thin, comfortable, with a 4-point suspension that will stay on in a fall, as well as being safe to mount batteries, flashlights, and brackets too. We threw extra batteries and flashlights into small utility backpacks, along with extra layers of warm clothing, as well as food and water. But then came perhaps the coolest part of the trip so far. Given that the Glacier National Park is pretty much inaccessible to anyone but experienced hikers, the rangers out there had planned something a little special for us to save us exhausting ourselves before the exploration even began. A helicopter ride into the park itself. We were told to be in a certain field at a certain time, which we were, and seeing that chopper coming in from a distance, the thudding of its rotor blades shattering the early morning tranquility, it was just incredible. I'm a huge fan of old war movies, and if it wasn't so chilly that morning, it might have felt like we were back in Vietnam or something. Special forced guys being airlifted behind enemy lines or something. Despite being ferried deep into the national park via helicopter, finding a safe place to drop us off was another thing entirely. We landed about a mile's hike from the cave system itself, with one of the rangers guiding us up a set of steep paths which led to the tiny, restrictive entrance on a mountainside. We arranged a call-out time of 8:30 that evening, enough time for us to get out of the cave and back down the mountain to the landing site before sunset. After that, the park ranger let us hike back down to the chopper, and our journey began in earnest. I immediately understood why the cave system was previously unexplored. The entrance was barely traversable, even to us experienced cavers, and more than once, I had to completely exhale to make my torso fit through the narrow gaps. Hutch was the point man as he headed in, and each little cranny he had to shimmy through was properly assessed for danger. A larger man might have become stuck to suffer the same fate as that guy in Utah about 10 years earlier, something I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy. After about a half hour of serious anxiety that verged on claustrophobia, the tunnels began to open up a little, and I really do mean a little. They were still narrow enough that we could do nothing but crawl on our hands and knees, occasionally just our bellies, in order to get deeper inside a place that, apparently, no man or woman had tread before. It was terrifying, but thrilling in a way that I didn't think I could put into words. It's like one long burst of adrenaline, knowing you're the vanguard of subterranean exploration, and you can almost feel it buzzing in your fingertips. So the last thing I was expecting when we found ourselves crawling into a larger, more open cave was to hear Hutch's disappointment. As you can imagine, you can't make loud noises in a cave system. You have to be as quiet as possible, given that reverberations and echoes can quite easily cause a cave-in if the rock isn't of a certain density. So at first, I couldn't quite make out what Hutch was getting at. I mean, I seriously thought he was injured, or something at first. He started hissing and whispering curses, balling his fist in frustration at something he'd seen illuminated by the lamp on his helmet. After he crawled through, I watched him sit down, leaning back against a cave wall with his face obscured by his hands. I asked him what the matter was, but he just shook his head, a melancholy to his body language that I'd rarely seen before, as he pointed to the opposite side of the cave. There, lying on the cold stone floor, was a burlap sack, a small, leather-bound notebook sitting just nearby. Only then did I join him against the cave wall, sorely lamenting the fact that this wasn't going to be the Virgin expedition that we imagined it to be. But that didn't mean we were about ready to give up. Not by a long shot. Whoever had been down in this place previously had officially and obviously never recorded their findings, so the door for us to map out and name the place was still very much a possibility. But before we pushed on, we decided to search the burlap sack and inspect the small book for clues as to what we might be up against as we moved deeper. As I nicked open the sack, I could see there were remains of some old food container, along with an old-style water flask, both of which were empty. They looked old, extremely old, and I hurried to inspect the small book to see if it had any trace of a date inside. The thing fell apart in my hands, moisture and time having long eroded the pages and bindings, but we did find a page where the date was partially legible. It read 1860 something, the last number completely worn away by the damp cave air. The book had been sitting down there for the better part of 200 years, and although we couldn't read a single full sentence of what was written in it, I'd have given anything to know what the cavers of yore thought of their subterranean experiences. As we advanced further into the cave system, I couldn't help but wonder just what would cause an explorer to just abandon their notebook like that. But we soon discovered the reason. 2 caves over, we found them. Hutch called it out as soon as the beam of his headlamp passed over the dome of rib bones that jutted out from the rock. It was nothing short of terrifying, knowing they'd come down here one day, never to return, never to see their loved ones again, and all the while the reasoning for being down here eluded us. After that, here were 3 things we saw before we turned tail and got out of there. The first were the skeleton's finger bones. Basically, a person's finger bone is divided up into 3 distinct sections, the smallest sections being in a person's fingertip. These have a pretty distinct shape. Go ahead and Google it, and you'll see what I mean. So it was pretty evident to us that something traumatic had occurred that wore the tips of the bones away. It felt intensely creepy, speculating how this guy had potentially lost his way in the caves, gone mad as a result of the deprivation and darkness, and began to scratch at the walls of the cave until his fingers had worn down to the bone. And even then, he hadn't stopped scratching. But we couldn't find any sections of the cave wall that bore the marks he would have made, which led us to the second thing we saw before we got the hell out of there. It was his skull. There were scratch marks on his skull, right around the orbital sockets. None of us said a thing about it as we studied the yellowing bone under our headlamps, because it was obvious what had occurred here. Down in the dark, almost 200 years before, he had scratched out his own eyes. We were already backing the cave out at this point, praying we wouldn't get lost on the way back, as this poor soul had obviously done. I tried not to think about the moment that the poor soul's lamplight had run out, condemning him to spend what little time he had left in absolute darkness. I tried to show Hutch and Nestor, but they weren't in the least bit interested in hanging around any longer. And to be honest, I totally understood why. As we sat around the open field we landed at, waiting for our helicopter taxi to arrive, we agreed not to talk about what we'd seen until we got back to Boston. There was a good chance that if we told the Rangers what we'd seen, they'd ask us to go back in and retrieve the body of the old caver, something none of us were particularly keen to do. And as much as we agreed not to talk about it until we got back home, there never did come a time when we discussed what we'd seen down there, ever. I mean, when the Rangers asked us how the caving had gone, we just told them it was unsafe to be down there, and there was no chance of turning the cave system into a tourist trap, let alone a place for experienced cavers to go when they wanted a challenge. I suppose I've waited a long time to get this whole thing off my chest. So, now, I suppose everyone knows about the body down there in the caves of Glacier National Park.